You're live.
Thank you. I assume we're all here. Thank you so very much for being with us today. Let me first of all acknowledge and thank all of you for your hard work thus far. We've got a lot of work ahead, and today is an opportunity for us to get a little bit more in depth about the challenges we face and how we got to this point. I hope that you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving and that we're prepared today to engage very thoroughly in much of the work ahead of us. It's going to be divided into several sections today. And because time is of a premium, we're going to try to stick fairly close to the schedule that is outlined. There will be opportunities for questions, analysis, discussions as we go through the presentation throughout the day. So let me apologize in advance in case anyone is concerned about how we move this agenda along. This agenda was put together by myself, Rachel, and to some degree Britt, trying to hit many of the highlights and the things that we obviously need given the time that we have with this meeting and subsequent meetings in the foreseeable future. We're going to start in just a moment. I was about to say so, and I see Britt has his mouth full.
So, I'm good.
All right.
Ready to go.
About a 5-minute presentation with Britt on some of the general overview, and then we're going to go right from there directly to Mark and get engaged in the full discussion for this afternoon. So Britt, why don't you take it away?
Okay, thank you so much, Ike. Well, I'm going to want to try to give as Ike said, a 5-minute summary of how we ended up with the blueprint bill and some of the thinking that the commission engaged in as we went along the way. And I'm going to watch my watch very carefully not to exceed the time. So I think all of you know that the commission was created in 2016 by an act of the General Assembly, which the governor approved, blessed, and was involved in the selection of some of the members of the commission. And I was asked to be the chair of this commission. It's important for everyone to understand how broadly representative the commission was. And this was set up in the legislation in many ways. Local boards were represented, the superintendents were represented, the county commissioners were represented, the State Board of Education was represented, the business community, the two collective bargaining units, MSEA and the Baltimore Teachers Union. The PTA was represented, higher ed was represented. The state superintendent was on the commission, as well as 8 members of the General Assembly. So it's hard to think of an organization that that's tied to pre-K through 12 education that wasn't represented on the commission. Now, there were multiple elements to our charge. We were to assess the adequacy of funding and the Thornton formula, to look at funding equity, but the overarching driver and the thing that the commission was focused on was this notion that was asked of us in the charge to make recommendations that would enable Maryland students to perform at the level of the best performing school systems in the world. And the thinking there was, we're in a global economy, and we would just want to ensure that our children, when they graduate from high school, are equipped to be competitive in the global marketplace and to have an education that is as good as the best. Obviously, that was charge, because that's you can't set a higher standard than that. As we began our work, there were 3, I would say, major surprises to many of us. I'm sure some knew these facts, but the vast majority of the commission was surprised. 3 very important facts that will be addressed by Mark as we go through this presentation. First, Maryland was viewed as a regressive state in terms of school funding. This came as a great shock. We always, people think of Maryland as a very progressive, liberal state. But when you look at the adequacy of funding for low-income kids in comparison to funding for more advantaged kids, Maryland falls way below the median in most studies as a regressive state. That was a shock to us and something we knew we had to address. Also, we were surprised to learn that Maryland performs as a state at a very mediocre level in comparison to other schools on standardized exams. I think most people thought Maryland's schools were good, with some pockets that were not doing so well. But we learned that this sense of mediocrity in terms of performance was pervasive across the state. And then we learned that if that wasn't bad enough, that the U.S. is very mediocre in comparison to on international exams like the PISA exam. So here we are asked to make recommendations so that we perform as well as the best performing school system in the world, and we're confronted with these three rather shocking surprises. So we had to ask ourselves, do we really have the capacity within the commission to make recommendations to ensure that respond to this overarching charge? Well, it turned out, and this was so fortuitous, that there's an organization called the National Council of State Legislatures, which brings together representatives, it's very nonpartisan, brings together representatives from state legislatures all across the country. It advises the national governors group. And it turns out that NCSL, the National Council of State Legislators, had asked this very question: what would it take for Maryland U.S. schools to perform at the level of the best performing schools in the world? They had asked this a few years earlier, and Rachel and Rich Madaleno, who was then on the General Assembly, had been part of a group that had tried to investigate this question, and they had discovered the organization, the National Center for Education, National Center for Education and the Economy, led by Mark Tucker, so they brought this information to the commission, and we realized that we needed the support of NCEE and Mark. And the point about this organization is, and this is important for everybody to understand, that after they spent years studying, doing exhaustive research on what are the elements of the best performing school systems in the world, exactly what we needed to know. And out of this research, they had identified certain building blocks that were common in these high performing systems. So we did bring Mark and NCEE on as consultants. And what we decided to do, and this took 3 years to do. Now, a year for the commission, please remember, we didn't meet when the General Assembly was in session. So from January to April, we didn't meet. So a year for us was basically 8 months. But we spent 3 years doing an unbelievably intensive gap analysis, comparing what Maryland does to 4 high-performing international systems: Finland, Shanghai, Singapore, and Ontario. And we threw 2 U.S. states into the mix just to have a U.S. component of the study: Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And so I couldn't possibly convey how the level of detail and intensity with which we spent these 3 years doing this gap analysis. I think Mark will give you some flavor of that. We divided our commission into committees, and we invited experts to actually serve on some of these committees, and it was open to the public. And we heard from people that had, vested interests and ideas about the issues we were groping with as we began to develop our recommendations. We after this deep dive and intensive work, we developed a preliminary report in January of 2019. And this included, as you well know, major recommendations grouped into 5 categories and a total cost of implementing these recommendations. I want to emphasize that these recommendations were very much the product of the commission. The commission had to take the gap analysis and build recommendations in the Maryland context that would work in the state of Maryland. So, the commission was greatly informed by these outside experts, by citizens who came to testify. Now, one thing we were very concerned about was equity. And this was a overarching driving concern for the commission. And based on the recommendation of a number of groups, we brought in an expert on equity. His name was Ivory Tolston. Ivory is a professor at Howard University. He was chair of the White House initiative on HBCUs. He also was the creator of an organization called Quality Education for Minorities. And his expertise is very much about equity in all of its forms in education. So we gave our preliminary recommendations to Ivory and told him, you read this through the lens of equity, and you come back and tell us, if we haven't touched on all the points with equity. And he did. He had some staff. They poured through the report. They made 17 suggestions, which we embraced every one of them in our final report. So we issued this preliminary report with the recommendations and the total cost of funding in January of 2019. And when we took the final vote, the vote was 21 in favor, none opposed, 3 abstentions, and I think there was maybe a couple people absent. But the point is, there was not a single dissenting vote from this very eclectic group that had come together. It was one of the proud, I guess I still get goosebumps thinking about this, how much this committee came together around these very difficult issues with this big number out there for the funding. Now, the General Assembly, they were happy with the preliminary report, but they needed the funding formula, not just the total cost. We spent 2019 developing a funding formula, and incidentally, a funding formula, and that we then passed the final report, which included the formula. The recommendations had already been developed. The total cost was already there, but then we spent the 2019 developing the funding formula and issued our final report in January of 2020. And it passed both houses with bipartisan support, which I thought was a very significant factor. However, 2020, as you all know, is when COVID first really emerged in the United States, and the General Assembly had to adjourn early in January, and or I'm not sure it's January, but it had to adjourn early, and the governor ended up vetoing the bill in May. But then when the General Assembly came back in 2021, the veto was overridden, and the blueprint bill is very much a product of the recommendations the commission made. So, Ike, I'm afraid I went over a little bit the 5 minutes, but I hope this was helpful to the members in getting the big picture before we get into some of the really rationale and the level of thought that went into the recommendations that Mark is going to lead us through.
Well, thank you, Brett, for not only your presentation, for all the work that you and your commissioners have done over the last few years of getting us to this point. We have a lot of questions and issues to look at. And so let's turn to Mark. And Mark, it's all yours. Let's get started.
Thank you, Ike. NCEE has been doing research, as Britt said, used by the countries that lead the world in student achievement since 1989. It's a long time. 6 years ago, we got a call from Rachel asking if we could help this commission that the work of which Britt has just described. Our job today is to take you through the data and analysis that we presented to the commission and the recommendations we made. Our aim is to help you understand the reasoning behind those recommendations. Betsy Brown-Ruzi and I and the rest of our NCE team are proud of the work that we have been able to do and the contribution that we've been able to make. But if I had a penny for every research report with recommendations on education policy issued in the last 30 or 40 years that went nowhere, I would be a very wealthy man. The commission report, as Britt just suggested, is the work of a team, of which we are and were just a part. Its success owes an enormous debt to Rachel, who played a key part in launching the commission and whose encyclopedic knowledge of Maryland law and of the substantive issues, legislative and political skill, and the respect in which she is held by the members of the House of Delegates on both sides of the aisle were absolutely indispensable, as was Rachel's legislative services team. The Kirwan Commission would almost certainly have been a failure were it not for Britt Kirwan. It started out as a gathering of people chosen to represent all the widely divergent and often conflicting interests involved in Maryland education, just as Britt just described. And as he said, they ended up uniting around a revolutionary plan. It was really Britt who did that. His vision, his patience, his skill, and above all, his high integrity made all the difference. Betsy and I were lucky too to be reunited with our friends of many years, Augenblick, Polite, and Associates of Denver, Colorado, consultants to many, many states on school finance issues. One of those states, of course, was Maryland. And not least, the commission itself, the big hero, most of whose members, as Britt told you, met every month when the legislature wasn't in session. When this all began, they were told it would be for 1 year. And as Britt told you, it ended up being for 3. They met usually for a whole day. And it was astonishing. They rarely missed a meeting. Many came from quite a distance. It was they who, at the end of the day, made this report, taking the data and the analysis and the recommendations that we're about to share with you and fashioning them into a report that fits Maryland, its history, its people, its traditions, its needs, and its politics. So Rachel, let's get started with the slide deck.
All righty, give me 1 second.
Okay. Okay. So can you go full screen with that?
There you go.
Super. All right. So as I said, these are the ideas behind the blueprint for Maryland's future. Next slide. So here's the plan for the day. Ike summed it up a few minutes ago. It's a 4-part agenda. We start with talking about what's at stake for Maryland. And when we have done that, we will share with you in some detail the gap analysis that Britt referred to. That is, point by point, comparing where Maryland is on the key features of first-rate systems with the features of those systems as they look in the top performing countries. When we're done with that, we're going to do share with you a set of special analyses of the report, looking at it through a series of lenses that I think you will find very revealing. And finally, when we're done with that, we will talk about the role of the AIB, how it was conceived, and share with you some of our views about what's most important as you think about how you're going to go about implementing it. I have a giant apology to share with you. What you are going to experience in the next, what is it, 3.5 hours, is a great many slides. And I want to tell you that right up front. We, in the end, saw no alternative. This is our chance to bring you inside the report. And I think if you will put up with the format, I hope and believe that you will find it rewarding. What we're going to do is start each of these 4 sections with a presentation based on the slide deck. We will entertain questions, but only questions during that part of our time together that are intended to clarify points that have been made as we go through the presentation. We strongly urge you to keep them to a minimum, because following each of these presentations, we want as much time as possible for a full and open discussion. That's what's going to occupy the majority of our time. We may or may not get as far into these issues as you decide ultimately you would like to get. But Rachel has assured us that if you want us to come back, we are more than happy to do that. So our aim here is not to drill all the way in on these issues, but to help you see the whole picture. Next slide. Oh, excuse me. So we begin with the prologue. For years, for almost 150 years, the United States led the world in public education. It was the United States that built the world's first mass education. We did that in the middle of the 19th century when we first instituted compulsory elementary education in many parts of the country, piece by piece, place by place, town by town, state by state. And then at the end of that century and the beginning of the 20th, we did the same thing again. We led the world in making secondary education compulsory, turning it from an institution, our high schools, that had mostly been for elite kids headed to an even more elite institution, that is higher education, colleges and universities, into a mass education institution, education for everyone at the secondary level. And then finally, we did it again after the Second World War, when we turned what had been all over the world, education institutions for a very small elite, once again, turned it into a mass education system from one end of the country to the other with the GI Bill. What most people don't know is that the elementary and secondary system we have now, its shape, its structure, is pretty much in place by the 1930s. It hasn't changed much since then. It was that system that made us the world's leading industrial power. That happened in part because the design of the system was perfectly matched to the needs of the world's leading mass production smokestack industrial economy of the 1920s and 30s. Next slide. Now fast forward to the 1970s. As I said a moment ago, the system that we developed was a system for the needs of the economy, the American economy of the 1920s and 30s. And if you looked at the structure of our high schools, you could see it pretty clearly. More than half of the high school students graduating in the 1970s, that was about 2 decades after I went to high school, were in the general track. These kids had not much more than what we now describe as the basic skills. It was enough to do most of the work of the United States at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. It was enough to do our work in mining, in the forests, the fishing that we did in the seas. It was enough to do the retail work, most of it all over the United States. And it was much more to the point. It was all the skills that most of the people on the factory floor needed to do their work. It's still the same system. And what I'm going to show you in a few minutes is that it is producing the same results. But at least through the 1960s, what I have just described was still enough to make the American workforce the best educated workforce in the world. Next slide. What few Americans noticed was that during that period between the end of the Second World War and the early 1970s, an enormous transformation had taken place in many other countries. Many nations whose workers had been mostly illiterate after World War II had actually overtaken us in attainment. Attainment is basically a measure of how much education you have. They had exceeded us. Countries that had been mostly illiterate only a few decades before had by that time exceeded us in the average number of years of education that their workforce had. And they had figured out how to provide a better quality of education to those people coming into their workforce than we were offering our kids. Among the first to notice this was manufacturers all over the world. And they were rapidly during the 70s beginning to shift production to countries offering better educated workers whose wages, when we did our own research in the 1990s, were 1/10 to literally 1/100th of the wages that were earned by the average American factory worker, 1/100th. The data now show that young American workers, once the best educated, are now among the least well-educated in the industrial world. If I had to pick out from all the bullets you are going to see this afternoon, the most important, that would be among the top 5. It tells you what the future of this country is going to be if we don't do something fast. As far back as the year 2000, though, you could see another looming problem. When we gathered the data on this for a report we issued in 2000, 22 years ago, for every job that was being outsourced, 10 were being automated. Next slide. That was here in the United States. Now, according to the University of Oxford, half of the jobs in the US economy can be automated with currently available equipment. Half. Many have not yet been automated because the expense, the machines that would do those jobs and can do them today are more expensive than the people doing them. But that is changing at lightning speed. The cost of those machines is declining at increasing rates, and their capability is increasing at astonishing rates. There is little doubt in the mind of many people that the jobs of fully half the people in the United States are in serious danger of being automated. The future of the Maryland economy is very bright if it can offer employers a rapidly growing number of well-educated and highly skilled workers. Next slide. But if Maryland does not fulfill that promise, if it doesn't move in that direction, if it doesn't obtain that objective, here's what you're going to see. The cost to the state of providing support to increasing numbers of unemployed and underemployed as a result of foreign competition and especially increasing automation is going to rise as revenues decline. More and more people will need subsidies and they won't be earning salaries that will pay taxes. These costs and a low quality workforce will combine to make the state very unattractive to employers. And that will force a downward spiral in Maryland's economy. Next slide. So actually, Maryland has a simple choice. Maryland can either compete by fielding one of the best educated workforces in the world, or Maryland can lower its wages to equal the wages that other countries are paying workers with the same skill level as ours, but who are now getting paid much less. I think there's little doubt that if Maryland chooses the latter course, there's a very good chance it could result in widespread poverty and political chaos. That, in our view, is what's at stake. Next slide. So we talked breezily about what it means, how important it is to match the top performers. But how would you select them? What do you mean by a top performer? We use two basic measures, easily the best measures of the two big things we needed to measure to get there. One was a way to select the top performing states in the United States, and the other was to select the top performing countries in the world. The NAEP data that goes back more than 40 years now, comparing states' performance with one another on assessments of many things, but certainly among them, reading, mathematics, and science, and the PISA assessments from the OECD, which began in the year 2000 and are administered in full every 3 years to a rapidly growing number of countries. It's now near 100. And we used, we thought hard about what we would take as criteria for what we meant by performing. And you're looking here in the bottom 3 bullets at where we came out. The first is student performance on these measures. Are they perfect measures of everything that anybody would want kids to know and be able to do and be like as humans? No, but they are by far the best measures that are available for measuring student performance. But student performance was not all that we were interested in. The second thing is, as Britt said, gets to equity, which we framed. There are many measures, by the way, of equity that the people who do these statistics are using, and they're all very interesting and useful for different purposes. But what we had in mind mainly was the distance between the top 10% of performers and the bottom 10% of performers. And finally, we asked ourselves, can we think about these systems in part by comparing how much you get for the dollar or the shekel or the pound? How much are taxpayers getting for their money? Next slide. The first bullet up on the top, Britt has already taken you through the countries and states that we compared Maryland to. And the down below is the summary of what we found in the OECD data. It is very sobering. As I told you, the first PISA assessments were in the year 2000, the most recent in the year 2018. So in the year 2000, we were in, these are rankings, in the year using raw data. In the year 2000, we were 15th in reading, we were 14th in science, and an ugly 19th in mathematics. In 2018, the most recent year for which data is available from the OECD, we had gone up 2 notches in reading. It was certainly better than going down, but there are still a lot of countries ahead of us. We had gone from 14th in science to 19th. And astonishingly, we had gone from 19th in math to 38th by 2018. Next slide. As Britt told you, when the commission first met, people sitting around the table were mostly convinced that Maryland was one of the top performing countries in the United States. They were astonished to learn that when you look at the NAEP data, even though Maryland is one of the richest states and its population, its adult population is among the best educated in the country, Maryland came out with average student performance. Although Maryland has schools of which any state could be proud, and it certainly does, student performance on average, it turns out, is just as mediocre as the performance of the United States as a whole. As Britt said, that came to as a terrible shock to the commission. Next slide. Here's just one little window into the math part of this, and it's really quite stunning. Algebra 1 is a middle school course in Maryland and over most of the United States. You're supposed to pass it at the end of middle school, usually in grade 8. But only 50% of white graduates are proficient in math at the level of Algebra 1 when they graduate from high school. Only 12.5% of Hispanic graduates, only 11.4% of Black graduates are proficient in 8th grade mathematics when they graduate from high school. And just to put a finishing touch on it, the data also show that Maryland education system produces less for each dollar invested than most other states. Next slide. Here is another chart we shared with the commission, which I think stunned a lot of people. But don't worry about not being able to read everything on the chart. What you're looking at here is a chart of OECD countries, which include, by the way, many second and third world countries, of per pupil expenditure by country for 2011, which is the last date we have any data. And the highlighted 2 columns on the right, there's a little box up at the top that says United States, shows you where we place on that chart. There are only 3 countries that spend more per student than we do in this whole array. And one of them is the Principality of Luxembourg, a very tiny country in the middle of Western Europe. The other 2 are Norway and Switzerland. This is an impressive chart in terms of how much money is being spent. So next slide. I told you earlier, I pointed to a slide that I thought might be among the 5 most important of all the slides in this presentation. I would put this one in the same place. What you're looking, again, don't worry about reading the numbers, although we'll be if we haven't already, we'll be sharing all these slides with you and you can see the detail. But the main point of this is very easy to see. What you're looking at are 2 curves. One curve shows per pupil spending. And that's the one that starts low on the left and goes up high on the right. Starts in 1971 and goes to 2012. And that's all data from the United States government on the United States, taken as a whole. And then the other line is NAEP 12th grade reading scores. And what you will see is that over that entire period, on a scale of 500 points, reading scores didn't vary by more than 3 points. What this chart is telling you is that for a 240% increase in cost per student over that entire period, we got absolutely nothing in terms of improved student performance. The chart, by the way, for mathematics is nearly identical to this one for reading. Next slide. So this would make one think again about what I showed you with respect to how much money is spent. Here is a finding from the OECD that is very important, was very important for the work of the commission and will be very important for your work. The data from the OECD from more than 100 countries shows that once a country spends a total of about $50,000 American dollars per student on the entire education of a student from the beginning of elementary school to the end of high school, there is very little correlation between spending and achievement. Up to that point, there's a close correlation. The more money you spend, the better the results you get. But you are talking there about very poor countries. The amounts of money that we spend are vastly more than $50,000 per student. The bottom line here is what is in bold at the bottom. How you spend money on education is much more important than how much you spend. Next slide. So how can Maryland match the top performers? Well, there's only one way to do this. You can't just spend more money. You have to actually study how the countries at the top have managed to get to the top. What are the strategies they've been using? What are the policies and practices they have put in place? And then you have to develop a system based on those policies and practices that will produce better results in Maryland, at least as good, if not better. In the next part, we're going to share the results of just such a study. But before that, let's drop the slide deck presentation and have a discussion. Questions?
Yes, let me ask a question that has been at the core of some criticism from those who have not been as enthusiastic about the commission and its work.
Yep.
And I want to make sure that I fully understand it, because the argument has been, well, Maryland is spending as much or more than most other communities or countries or states, but our performance is not as robust. And therefore, the problem is not that we need to provide more money, but we need to determine more how we use the monies that we already have. Is that a legitimate concern, and how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I've heard that from quite a few people, like, and it's a smart question and understandable. And basically, where we came out on that from the standpoint of looking at what the data says to us is the following. We think Maryland ought to be able to get to a point when it has fully implemented the designs used by the top performing countries, where its spending will be not much more than it is now, corrected by inflation. The problem is the following. It took the countries that are at the top 30, 35, or 40 years to get there. And Maryland doesn't want to take. In fact, it doesn't have time to take 25, 30, or 40 years to get there. It needs to go a lot faster than that. And when you analyze what it is actually going to take to do that, which is what we're going to try and help you do today, what you can see is that there are very large transition costs involved. Think money you need to spend now in order to get what you need later. It's not unlike what the country has just decided to do about physical infrastructure. In order to get the benefits of having good roads and airports and all the rest of it, you got to spend now to get there later. You don't have to spend at the rate the country is going to spend on infrastructure for the next few years forever, but you do have to make the transition, and we are very far behind. And the cost of that transition are going to be substantial.
Thank you. Rachel, could you monitor to see if there's any other questions or comments?
Sure, if you either just want to sort of give a little wave, or there is like a raise hand function somewhere.
I'll ask a very simple question. On that, thank you for the presentation. It's very helpful. On that second slide that you wanted us to look at it about the per pupil spending and the reading scores and NAEP, I assume that those are constant dollars. I just didn't see that.
Yes, yeah, they are corrected for inflation. That's correct.
Great, thanks.
Yep.
And we would have been happy to update it, but NAEP stopped doing long-term NAEP under the last administration. So lobby for doing it again, please.
Anybody else? All right.
Good. Okay, keep going.
So Rachel, bring our slide deck back and we'll press on.
You should be good to go.
Yep. Okay. So now we're going to do what I promised. We're going to share with you the results of the analysis that we did for the commission of where Maryland is and where these top performers are with respect to the policies and practices that they put in place and the strategies that they use. The question is, what should Maryland be doing if it wants to do what the top performers have done to get to the top? Next slide. So this is going to be this afternoon a first look, if you will, at school finance. We're going to look at it through the lens here of the usual school funding issues. There are other issues we'll get to later. So it turns out Maryland spent more per student than any of the 3 top performing states in the United States or any top performing country. As I said to you earlier, that's a stunning finding. Maryland had, as Britt told you, has had one of the most regressive school funding systems in the United States. This is actually the opposite of what the top performers do, as you will see. Next slide. Maryland, like all US states, has a funding system that's based on local property wealth. And you all say, yeah, well, we know that. But I think an awful lot of people don't quite get what I take to be the main implication of this. What that does is create a situation in which the rich get a low tax rate, and it enables them to produce a particular amount of revenue. That's because the rich can congregate in their own taxing areas. And when that happens, the poor gets high tax rates to produce the same amount of revenue. That is not only grossly unfair, but if you want to build a system that actually produces the same high outcomes for all kids, it is exactly the opposite of what you need to do. None of the top performing countries do it. Most of them collect and spend their funds, not at the local level, but at the state, provincial, or national level. And they use different strategies. They find different ways of providing more resources to schools with large numbers of students who will need them to get to common high standards. This is a very, very different funding theory than American states. What we have done for a very long time is say, well, the obligation of the state is to provide an adequate level of funding. And then after that, it's perfectly okay if rich people spend lots and lots and lots more money on their kids. Well, of course they get to higher standards, far higher standards. If your aim is to get virtually all kids to common high standards, you can't do that. You need another way of approaching it. Next slide. One of many issues, but a particularly important one with respect to finance, school finance funding, is special education. We spend a lot of money on special education. It turns out that we categorize as special ed kids twice the proportion of kids in our schools as the top performers do. And when Americans hear that, they say, well, oh God, that means we do a whole lot more for those kids than they do. We should be really proud of that. Look again at the statistics. The bottom 10th of their students are doing much better. They are much closer to the top 10th than in the United States. Spending all that special education money on those kids is not getting us equity. It is actually doing the reverse. The reason that we spend more money on special ed, the reason that is because we have so many more kids labeled special ed. And one of the reasons they perform so badly is because they are labeled special ed. But they're labeled special ed because they come to school well behind most other kids. And then for every year they stay in school, they do worse and worse. What the top performing countries do is the opposite. It is the opposite. When those kids, first of all, they, as you will see in a minute, they provide much more support to their kids before they arrive in first grade. But once they're in first grade, they do everything they can do to keep them on a high trajectory from the moment they walk in the door. They don't have to assign them as special ed kids because the kids' performance never gets to the point where they need to. This is a key point in school funding. So one last very important point here. I told you earlier that the US spends a whole lot more on its kids, actually nearly 50% more than the top performing countries in the OECD do. In fact, than any of the other countries in the OECD do. And so it looks like on the whole, you can say, well, we're just spending half again as much money on our kids as they do. That turns out not to be true. As you will see in a minute, the rates of poverty, child poverty in the United States are off the charts compared to the countries to which we are comparing ourselves here to. So it turns out that these top performing countries provide a lot more support to their kids before they get to the first grade than we do, that is not counted in the OECD statistics that I just shared with you. We don't have the metrics to compare these two big bunches of numbers. That is, the question here is, when you put how much is spent before the kids get to first grade in these other countries on their kids with what we do, it's a whole lot more. And with what we spend on the kids in school than they do, which is a lot more, we don't have the metrics to compare apples to apples. But most of the data that we have indicate that it's a wash, which is to say, when you put it all together, we're probably spending what they're spending. The difference, again, is not how much we're spending, it's how we're spending it. Next slide. This is a very quick summary of a complex program of spending decisions that the commission made. And Rachel, I'm sure, will take you much deeper into this. We recommended that the commission add a new weight in the formula for concentrated poverty. We recommended that the formula be made less aggressive, coming back to Britt's point. And we recommended that this comes back, by the way, to what I said a few minutes ago to Ike. We recommended that the commission increase the special education weight now, provide more money for special education now, but less later, as the performance of low-income and minority students improves. And then, when the system is functioning the way it ought to be functioning, then focus special education funds on the students with specific cognitive and physical impairments. That's about half the number of kids that we currently label as special education. Next slide. Betsy, you're on.
Hi, everybody. I'm Betsy Brown-Rizzi. I work with Mark on all of this. I'm going to talk about the gap analysis sections that have to do with early childhood education and supports for families with young children, and also teachers and leaders. So, as many of you know, and Mark has said, the US and Maryland provide much less support to families with young children than the top performing jurisdictions do around the world. In fact, for an example, most of them do not even have means tested supports to families for each child from birth to their teens. And an example is Singapore. They have a one-time baby bonus for each child a family has, for the $5,700 for the first child and $7,100 for each additional. Very generous. They have free health care, prenatal care, home visits for new mothers, health screening for newborns. They've got paid parental leave. They also have very high quality childcare and extremely high quality early childhood education. Some paid in full and some on a sliding scale depending on income. Next slide. And all of the international jurisdictions that we've studied provide free or very low cost preschool for 3 to 6 year olds. And this system is overseen by a Ministry of Education that tightly coordinates the preschool program of study with the public school education. So what happens in preschool is related to what comes next in elementary. Another important thing that they do is that the leaders of the institutions of early childhood ed almost always have at least a bachelor's degree, if not more. And teachers in that work in that system are typically certified. In most of the countries, they have bachelor's degrees as well. Next slide. You know, Maryland is definitely thought of, no doubt about it, as a leader, at least in this country, in providing support to families with young children. However, the state, as you could see from what I just said, is far behind top performing systems around the world. And particularly important, like Mark just said, is our level that we allow of child poverty. It's so much higher. And we don't offer most of the services that I just described. Next slide. We do have, and I'm sure most of you know about Judy centers and family support centers. These are well-regarded organizations nationally. Not every state has things like this. But what we found in our study is the services that they provide in both instances are not available to every family that needs them. Childcare is not affordable still for many families in the state. And fully universal early education is not available for children age 3 and 4. It's going to come a long way, no doubt about it, but still not fully universal. In Maryland, early childhood education teachers are paid less and have fewer career growth opportunities than teachers in the public schools. And that impacts, of course, the quality of education provided. And this has also been exacerbated, as you know, by the COVID crisis. Okay, continue. So the recommendations in this arena that we made to the commission was to expand the reach and comprehensiveness of the Judy centers and family support centers, make childcare for working families affordable, add early childhood educators to a statewide educator career ladder that I'm going to describe next, and invest in the early childhood workforce through a much more additional professional development. Expand enrollment of all children in quality pre-K programs, and add wraparound education, health, and support services. Okay, go ahead. So that's early childhood education and care. The next session, this one is very complicated. It's very detailed, and there's a lot more to this than I'm going to describe. This is about the instructional systems and gateways. In instructional system, we described to the commission as the system of goals, standards, curriculum, and instructional supports for elementary and secondary education. Just to give you a sense of how vast this topic is. So what we learned in the analysis was that Maryland's expectations for students were quite low at the time. Half or more of Maryland high school graduates, like Mark described already, cannot do middle school math and read only at a 7th or 8th grade level. And that's why typical first year college curriculum in the US is equal to about the first year of high school curriculum in the top performing countries. NCEE did a study looking at what it takes to succeed in initial credit bearing courses in a random sample of colleges across this country. And this is what we found, not just in Maryland, but around the country, that young people entering their first year of community college, for example, are doing math at a 7th or 8th grade level, or are reading at a much lower level than they need to be able to read and interpret the text that they're using in college. So in other words, if Maryland students are going to get to that world-class level, they're going to have to jump about 4 grades in reading, master Algebra 1 at least, and think and write far better than they do now. By the standards of the top performers, many of our high schools are just not high schools at all, if you think about it that way. That's Mark's favorite term. Okay, Rachel, go ahead. So that's a very short little presentation on the gap analysis on the instructional system. But another part of that instructional system is the state's career and technical education system that we looked at in depth. And Maryland, like the early childhood system, is widely regarded as having one of the better CTE programs in the United States. But just to give you a sense, when the OECD looked at career and technical education programs of countries around the world, it's no longer even including the United States in their analysis, because by the current global standard, the US doesn't meet the minimum standards for CTE programming. I don't know if you know this, but the way that we calculate nationally what that a student has gone through and completed a career and technical education program is having 3 consecutive classes in a common subject area. So you can interpret that widely. And as Mark said, only 9% of Maryland students are quote unquote CET completers.
By that standard.
Very low standard compared to international best practice. So Maryland won't get more better at this until it becomes a much more attractive option for students and their family, CTE that is. Go on to the next slide. So what's our problem here? Why is our vocational education system not up to world-class standards? First of all, unlike top performers, we don't have the leadership that it takes to build a world-class vocational education and training system from the employer and labor community. We really don't. Our training locations are not furnished with the latest technology and equipment. In other countries, you'll see them all being donated. Whole airplanes, for example, we saw in China, which is not a leader in career and technical education, but they want to be. And then training in the core subjects that's matched to application of theories in the workplace. We don't do that. And investments that are carefully matched to the economic strategies of the jurisdictions. That's a way of saying, you know, what these other top systems do is they start with looking at what kind of economy they want to be. They take that analysis and then they design programs of study so that young people can be successful in that particular economy. We don't do it that way. A CTE system that is attractive to good students, we need that. Right now, many people feel like it's just a dumping ground. Okay, go ahead. So the top performers, what do they do in the area of instructional systems? First of all, they actually internationally benchmark other systems. We don't even try that to learn what the desired outcomes might be. And then they express the outcomes they want for their students in their goals. They design a system to get the vast majority of young people to that standard, step by step. And they design their system to start the students at the same starting line. And they invest in catch-up programs so they don't slip back. We saw this all over the world in these top systems. Teachers spend so much of their time meeting together. And what are they talking about? Where are the young kids struggling? Who's struggling? Why are they struggling? What can we do about that as a team? So much of their time is about that. And they align all the components of their instructional system, their goals, their standards, the curriculum frameworks, and the assessment with each other. They make sense as a system. What they don't do is they never waive the standards. They do whatever it takes to help the students meet them. Okay. Mark, you want to talk about these vignettes? Because you're the
Yes,
one
sure.
who taught them.
These are all real things. These are me standing in a place. In the first one, standing, talking with a 17-year-old boy, young man in an apprenticeship program at ABB, one of the world's greatest manufacturing firms in Bern, Switzerland. And he is a clearly highly valued member of a team that is playing an important role in helping to build precision parts of ocean-going ship turbines. These are turbines which, if they start to fly apart, will kill people and the ship will stop dead in the water. The tolerances to which they build these turbine blades, which is what he was working on, are astonishing. He wasn't getting coffee for this team. He was learning how to do the work. The second point, eating lunch in Singapore, prepared by a student chef in Singapore's culinary program. When they designed their culinary program, they did what they designed for every single vocational education and training program in Singapore. They went and asked themselves, who is best at this work in the world? So their program, I discovered to my astonishment in the culinary field, was designed and is supervised by Paul Bocuse, one of the leading French chefs. And the last one, going to a Danish high school in the north of Denmark, where the Vikings came from years ago. I was talking with students in a first-year program for electricians. First-year program for electricians, kids comparable to our first-year high school students. They all talked to me in English. They had just finished, each of them, building their own multimeter from scratch. They had built it themselves. And what they were working on when I visited that class was writing, each one of them, writing their own manual in English for how to use and maintain the multimeter. They couldn't have done this without the knowledge they had of English, but they also couldn't have done it without a remarkable level of knowledge of physics and the calculus to write manuals, to write those manuals. I was blown away. This was clearly not a system where what we call career and technical education was for kids who couldn't do academics. Boy, could these kids do academics. Back to you.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, let's see.
I got it, Mark.
Yep.
So what does Maryland need to do? What were the recommendations here? The first thing was to conduct the research needed to reset standards for what the state calls college and career readiness to a global standard that are the actual requirements of success in the first year of credit-bearing courses in college. So that's the first order of business. And then expect students to achieve those standards by the end of their sophomore year in high school, not 12th grade, with time for those who cannot do that to achieve them by the end of high school. So that's a big recommendation. That changes system, expectations, funding flows, human capital investment. It's the core of this system. And Mark will talk more about that later. And then redesign the whole instructional system to make it possible for all students to attain college and career readiness on schedule. And then lastly, to rebuild the career and technical education system to global standards. Okay. So that's a lot. So the next one, which is as significant, also probably the key of getting this whole plan to work, is investment in the people that lead our system, teachers and school leaders. The top performers know that the quality of student performance will never exceed the quality of their teachers. So the quality of student performance will never exceed the quality of teachers. So what do? They routinely produce actually a surplus of highly qualified teachers. But in Maryland, at least in 2016, 1% of entering students at the University of Maryland College Park and only 5% of students at Towson identified teaching as a career choice. And applications to teacher education programs were plummeting then, and now even worse in COVID. We have a problem, okay? The top performing systems source their teachers from the middle to the top of their high school graduating classes. The US and Maryland source their teachers from the middle to the bottom of high school graduating classes. We don't mean to be offensive saying this. This is what the data showed us. The top performers educate their teachers in their research universities, and we educate the majority of our teachers in middle to lower tier institutions that in terms of their admission standards. It's pretty easy to get in comparatively. Okay, go ahead. What do the top performers do? They raise the bar for becoming a teacher when they're faced with teacher shortages. Because what have they learned? They've learned that this raises the prestige of teaching, and it actually attracts more and better high school graduates to the field. So it might seem a little backward, but it's actually true. Raise the standards, get higher qualified candidates. The US and Maryland, when we're faced with teacher shortages, we lower the bar. That's already pretty low. Another thing they do is they train their teachers not only to be expert in the subject areas they're going to teach. That's a key cornerstone of teacher education in these systems, but they train them as researchers. And why? So they can steadily improve the performance of their school and students in a very disciplined way. In the US and Maryland, teachers are the subject of research done by university researchers rather than partners in that research. Not everywhere, but in many instances. Go ahead. Another thing that the top performers do, they actually certify master teachers. They have a career ladder in education, and one of the rungs on that ladder is a master teacher who are certified after going through a major training program. And those folks train and mentor new teachers. They have a very important role in determining whether candidate teachers, young teachers, get a license to teach. There's no system for certifying master teachers in the US or Maryland. I know my sister-in-law teaches in the state. She's a 30-year veteran. She has mentored hundreds of teachers. She's never been paid a dime extra. It's all voluntary, and she's never been trained. She's excellent at it, but it's luck. They pay their teachers at rates that are benchmarked to compensation for other occupations requiring the same amount of professional education. Very important. And in Maryland, teachers' compensation has often lagged other professions with the same level of education by as much as 30%. So another very important thing is that the top systems, they give their teachers a lot more time than we do to work in teams, to pool their understanding of students who are falling behind and to collaborate on strategies to help them get better. They also use that time, not in front of kids, to work with these students, individual students who need extra help. It's part of the school day. And they work with colleagues on long-term projects to improve the curriculum and their skill in teaching it. It's also part of their regular week. Teachers are often in other teachers' classrooms. It's not unusual to see them critiquing each other's work. It's a very professional work organization and demonstrate new techniques and learning. It's very frequent you see more than one adult in the classroom. Very frequent. US and Maryland teachers are required to spend more time in front of students than any other OECD country. There isn't time to systematically improve the program or provide much help to individual students in our system. Okay, go ahead. The top performers, as I mentioned earlier, they have created professional career ladders for educators. Teachers in this system, these systems get more authority, they get more responsibility, more autonomy, status, and compensation as they show that they're getting more and more competent at the following things: teaching their subject area, teaching their subject area, contributing to the work of the teams, leading teams, and leading that research in the schools. And taking on, in each of these instances, more and more responsibility. In the US and Maryland, the job is this, in many cases, the job is the same on the last day as it was on the first. And the only way to move up and get paid more is based on time and service, or moving out into administration. So the bottom line here is that the top performers have created a professional model of teaching, and the US and Maryland are still stuck in a blue collar model. The top performers, you ask yourself, well, how can they afford this? Sounds wonderful. Lots more time, right? They pay for this model by having slightly larger class sizes. Slightly. OECD data clearly shows that the very large sums the US has paid to reduce class size have brought very little student performance, very little for what we spend on increased class size. If those sums had been spent on the model just described, that same data shows that there would have been major improvements in student performance. Of this, we are very confident. Okay. So the other part of the recommendations in this arena, teaching and school leaders, is the school leadership system. The career ladder I just described for teachers is really a career ladder in these other countries for educators, not just teachers. And there's a branch for teachers on the ladder who would like to become school leaders or who are identified as potential leaders. And in Maryland, in the US, individual teachers decide themselves whether they want to pursue an administrator's credential. So these other systems plan for developing leaders. We leave it up to the individuals to choose if they want to go into a leadership role, an administrator role. In fact, what we discovered was the top performing systems around the world have adopted their leadership development model from the US military and some of the best managed US corporations. For example, they, like in the military, you are never given the next job until you've done it well. And you're rotated through a lot of different positions before you move on to that leadership role. So they learn that from us. And then they also use tools from our companies that our companies use to identify leaders. They use those tools in their education system. So some things that we could actually borrow from ourselves for education systems. They identify teachers who they think have high potential for leadership, and then they invest in them systematically over a period of years. It's really exciting to see. So if you're in Singapore, you're in the classroom, and you've been identified, or you raise your hand because you'd like to be, you get lots of training, you get lots of different experience in different types of schools. And in fact, you don't even have to become just, a principal or a superintendent. You could go into the Ministry of Education. It's all one career development system. So what did we recommend? That Maryland develop a career ladder based on the best practices around the world, but built for the state. That the state should benchmark teacher compensation to occupations requiring similar levels of education preparation. Raise the standards for becoming a teacher, especially for ensuring mastery of subject matter content and how to teach that particular content well. And create incentives for top performing high school students from diverse backgrounds to choose teaching as a career.
Betsy?
Yeah.
You might mention with the career ladder that this is merit-based career ladder.
You have to show that you
point.
know and can do what the criteria to move up the ladder asks for. It's not time served.
There are two key points here, and Betsy made them really well. The first of them, the first point is the one you just made, Britt, which is one of the things that makes this a professional career ladder is that you don't have the same job forever. You get more and more responsibility as you show that you get better and better at the work. As you get more responsibility, you get paid more. So unlike our system that we have now, where you're basically getting paid for more time in the seat, you're actually getting paid for doing more and more, better and better. But the other feature of this system that is really critical is the way they've designed it. Because these teachers work in teams that are led by people who have shown extra competence, they've got a system in which the people who are the best at the work are training all the other people day by day. So the system is just getting better and better and better because they've got the right people in the right positions.
I think we might be done with this section. No? Okay, one more. Forgot this part. So another thing that was studied was teacher education programs of study in top performing system. And it's one area that I think is understudied in this country, but these systems put a lot of effort into making them top-notch institutions. They create, so first of all, they don't have a whole lot of them. I can't remember, Rachel, how many we have in Maryland, but in Singapore, they have one for the whole country. So they create incentives for
More than one.
preparation institutions to adopt top performers models of teacher preparation and professional development. And then include the branch I described of school leaders on the career ladder, and move Maryland to a more professional model of work organization. So these are all what I said already, but just on the teacher education program of study, if you go to some of these places, you'll see just the coursework is incredible investment in subject area knowledge and teaching that subject area really well. In fact, if you remember the data Mark showed on the mathematical performance on PISA, how it dropped precipitously in the United States, one reason is many of our elementary school teachers, don't like mathematics. They don't really want to teach it, but they have to because of the way we're organized. In these countries, elementary school teachers in math and science were majors in math and science, for example, just one example. Okay. Okay, that's you, Mark.
Yep, going back to me. So the last area in this series of gap analyses have to do with the way we organize our system for governance, and we govern our system in the way they govern theirs. They couldn't be more different. But let's just pick 5 key ways. First, in many of these systems, the school heads report to the district heads, who report up through the system to the chief executive of the ministry. That is to say, there's only one education system. It's for the entire province. It's for the entire state. It's for the entire country. It's all one staff, and one progresses up through it the way you would in any other organization. In our system, school superintendents don't report up the system. They report to a local or county school board. They have one school system. We have 14,000. In most of those systems, all of the functions related to education at every level are gathered together and coordinated in one organization. It's the ministry. In our system, those functions are scattered among many agencies, which often function not just separately, but at cross purposes. They have different interests. Next slide. In most of the top performing systems, there's one civil service structure with school faculty at the bottom and the system CEO, a professional educator, at the top. In our system, by the way, in that system, the only person with a political role is the person to whom the CEO of the entire system reports. That's the Minister of Education. In our system, superintendents report to elected boards, not to the State Board of Education or to the Chief State School Officer, who often makes less than many superintendents do. Our elected boards, of course, are not required to have any education expertise. Next slide. Many of the top performing systems have 5 to 10 year long state or national education plans, each one developed after years of research and very wide consultation throughout the country, each coming up with detailed timelines, multi-year plans that are all of the relevant government agencies have helped to develop. And they're fully committed to. That is, the agencies are committed to the plans because they help develop them. Because of the lengthy development period, there you get very wide development and detailed planning. And you get, especially, most important here, commitment to the plan. The commitment to the plan typically outlives the changes in party and administration in these countries, providing much more continuity than you see in this country over the long term, because they get continuing support for the plan from a very wide range of constituencies that were deeply involved in putting it together. In these countries, more attention typically is paid to planning for implementation and doing it and seeing how it's going and correcting for it than is put into the planning process. None of these things are true here, of course, in the United States. Next slide. The top performers pay a lot more attention to international comparisons of student performance than in the United States or Maryland, as Betsy told you. And they often have separate units in the ministry whose entire charge is to benchmark the performance of other countries, figure out what strategies they are using, and figure out how to adapt those strategies for use in their own countries. They systematically test out the ideas that they bring back in selected districts that are picked for their representativeness and their ability to pilot these ideas and figure out how to perfect them. And when they have done that in a very systematic way, they then, over a period of years, expand the use of those strategies and the implementation of those programs throughout the entire country. We don't do these things in any state. Next. So we recommended that Maryland invent a way to achieve globally competitive results with its decentralized and fractionated system of government. And that starts with developing a coherent, powerful plan for implementing the legislation that includes all the agencies of Maryland government that are involved or ought to be involved, and making sure that the plan lives, not just on paper, but in practice at every level of the system. Next slide. This is the last slide in this whole sequence, and it is among the most important. It has to do with what we in our organization call systemness. What is systemness? In a well-functioning system, think about an airplane or an automobile or high performance anything. All the parts and pieces work in close harmony with all the other parts and pieces. Each is designed to support the rest. We're often asked to pick a few priorities among the parts of the system just described. We can't do all of this. Why don't you tell us which ones are most important? We may get to the others later. And that misses the entire point. The effects of a good early childhood, I'm just reading this sentence, thinking about my experience over the years. As many of you probably know, there's been this enormous tug of war about early childhood education in the United States. There have been those who've said it's America's salvation and those who've said, well, when you measure the effects after a few years, they seem to wash out. Yes, of course. And that's the point of the beginning of this paragraph. The effects of a good early childhood program wash out if they're not followed up by a solid elementary school program. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do the early childhood program. What it means is you should follow up with the right kind of elementary program. A good curriculum will not produce good results, of course, if it's taught by poorly educated teachers. Does that mean it's not worthwhile bothering with curriculum? No, it means you need to have highly educated teachers too, not instead of. Well-educated teachers will leave if they have to work under poor leaders. Does that mean we shouldn't educate the teachers? No, it means they need to have good leadership, and so on. And what I've just tried to express with these 3 sentences is that's the entire plan. That's the entire plan. The commission is deeply devoted to this idea of systemness, that the whole thing fits together. You can't leave parts and pieces out. Top performers are top performers because they've learned how to build effective systems. That's your job. Your job is to help them build effective systems. Next slide. Okay.
Let me, are you there?
Yep.
Thanks very much for that session. I had 2 overriding questions that I thought about over the last couple of weeks, and just like your response on. First is a governance question. And I think you hit on it at the end there for just a moment, and you discuss the fractionalization that exists in virtually every system in this country.
Yep.
And you compare that to the systems in other places where it is much more centralized. One of the challenges that we are having today, unfortunately, is that there is just a counter reaction in America. That more and more people at the local level are arguing for it, supportive of more local control, more say so in the governance of their local school boards and the systems that govern them. And a suggestions of how we centralize that, the amount of time and effort to right that ship today in the face of those headwinds, to me, is a very difficult, time-consuming effort. So the timing of, quote, centralization is met by the headwinds of a real demand for decentralization and local autonomy. Can you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I agree with every word you just said. I think that accurately describes where we are as a country, as a state, all over the United States. And by the way, not just with respect to public education,
Right.
but I think for many people right now who've lost any hope of gaining control over their lives, they think of schools and their school district as the last place left,
Yeah,
where they can have some impact. And so the issue of local control is no small issue, as you just pointed out. And we were all, and the commission was, I think, very much aware of that. How shall I put this? I think that there are a lot of people who, when I make a presentation of the kind that we're making today, just want to get down to what the proposals are. In effect, they want to leave out the whole prologue that I shared with you. I don't think you can do that, because among the things I was sharing with you is that chart that showed how much money we have spent over the last almost half a century now, since the early 1970s, and how much we've got for it. The American people have no idea that that's true. They don't know. Nor do they, I think, understand that if we continue on the path that we are on, if we don't change things that other nations have changed years and years ago, our kids are going to be in the deepest possible trouble. The majority of Americans believe that the American schools as a whole are in deep trouble, but their own schools are just fine. And as long as that is true, they aren't going to change their schools. They most especially won't interfere with local control. I think they need to understand that one of the biggest reasons that other countries have been successful and we have not is the quality of our teachers and the policies that have been set and the attitudes that have been taken by local school boards. I think they need to understand the connection between the way we treat our teachers, and this, I'm pointing here at career ladders and school organization as well as local control, has everything to do with the future of their kids. My point is, I think that you put your finger on one of the single biggest challenges the AIB is going to have. And I think all I can say to that is that when Britt chaired his first meeting of the AIB, of the commission, he was facing a commission which was committed to local control, which believed that Maryland had one of the best school systems in the country and perhaps even in the world, and that their kids were doing just fine. And it wasn't until we just put all these cards on the table that they said, "Oh my God." And then the table was open for what Britt did next, which is to have a conversation. That the conversation that the first part had cleared the decks for. We didn't lay in front of the commission, nor did the commission adopt a program of leaving local control behind. If people say that, it's not true. What we did do, and what the commission, what we recommended, and what the commission, I thought, did a terrific job of doing, was figuring out how to take some of the features of those systems that are functioning very well and redesign them for use in our system, doing it our way. And I think that's what the AIB, I honestly believe what the AIB has to do is do what the commission did. Go through that whole line of logic with everybody.
Gotcha.
Can I just say a couple things on this? I think two other points. One is that the AIB has, like Mark said, opportunity to communicate what this is all about to the local level. it was part of the charge in the original piece of legislation, but it never got funded. It never happened. So there's a vacuum here on understanding
Yep.
around the state that I think can only be improved.
Gotcha.
So a communication plan. Secondly, I think that the change in the putting in the career ladder in place, which empowers teachers and school leaders in so many different ways, will make them stronger communicators to their public, which is their parents. They're gonna have a much more positive experience in school. I mean, right now it's very, very difficult. Teachers are not, they're exhausted.
I understand.
But this is
Let
positive.
me get to that point about the teachers. This is my second question, and I'll stop and maybe let others talk. The challenge that we face are twofold. We have a problem today, and not only the quantity, the numbers that we have of teachers, but also in the quality of the teachers that we have based on what you provided. And what this plan suggests is a more robust role for the teachers in helping to make certain that we achieve the objective. There is no way, shape, or form you can do that without having the quantity and the quality of teachers in the classroom. And you're going to need more of both.
That's right.
And going back to the question I raised earlier about the timing, it appears to me that in order to meet that requirement I've just started in terms of quantity and quality, it will take more time. You just can't simply say, oh, we're going to pay someone more, and you end up with both the quantity and quality. We just can't say, well, we're going to enhance the profession overnight. And so you run into that dilemma of how you get there fast. One of the things on the quality is that why not invest much more heavily in things that allow you to improve the quality almost instantly? That's one of the things that you can do faster than some of the others, meaning that you can provide the resources, provide the additional training, provide the certification. All of those come fairly quick, while at the same time, you're improving the pipeline for the quantity that you need as well. But it seemed to me that you can address the quality by inserting in requirements to recertification, or not recertification, but certification, ensuring that you have the pay, the opportunity to go back to school. And I looked at the plan in Maryland. I think there's a 5-year gap in there before you even get back to some semblance of re-education for us. Those things to me can come faster than you can in producing people who are still in college about their desire to become teachers long-term.
So I think, sure, Betsy will have something important to say about this, but my own, we here in the United States, when we talk about the quality of teachers, we talk about teacher education. And that, I think, is a big mistake. What we focused on first was the education of teachers. What happens in in almost all American teacher education programs is not teacher education. It's not the education of teachers, it's teacher training. And the problem is the one that Betsy identified earlier. You saw the enormous distance that this country and Maryland are behind the top performers in mathematics. There is absolutely no question in my mind why that's true. If you look at the discussion on mathematics teaching in the United States, it is, I believe, ridiculous. What the data show is that our kids do pretty well on international and national assessments of elementary school math, and then they fall apart in middle school. That's because the tests of elementary math test just the procedures. Can you add up a column of figures? Can you divide them? Can you multiply them? And can you do that fairly automatically? Well, yeah, we do that pretty well. The reason they fall apart in middle school is because the kids don't understand why all that works. That's why they can't do it. And you know why they don't understand why it works? because their teachers don't know why it works. Because when we recruit our teachers from the bottom half of the kids coming in out of high school graduating classes, those are the kids who couldn't pass middle school math. And they never took any more math. That's the way the system is.
I got you.
So they're teaching math the way they learned it. So it's not as if you can take an elementary school teacher, most of them, and send them to a 3-week workshop and they'll do a much better job of teaching math. They won't. They have to have the education in mathematics that they missed in school and in the university. And that is a much tougher problem. Maryland can't solve its problem by quickly upgrading the skills of its teachers, because the biggest problem it's got is the way they were educated in the first place. The way I think about this is that you can look at any education system, I don't care where it is in the world, and explain much of what is going on by asking how were those teachers educated themselves, because these systems replicate themselves. That's what they do. The teachers who go into our elementary schools are replicating the education they got in elementary school.
Rachel, in terms of the plan, though, for investments of the kind that Ike described, I do believe that we start relatively quickly doing a whole lot of things.
Yeah, we do.
Salary bump up, that's there to retain and attract people into the profession. We do the immediate you can sit for national board certification if you've been in the classroom at least 3 years. That's immediate, along with a pay hike. I mean, that's attractive because it's substantial. There were quite a few things that were quick.
Okay.
Well,
And the 5-year thing was really about, the national board certification, you have to get recertified according to their rules.
Right.
So
there's also a very large tutoring program built into the whole plan.
Right.
And that could, depending on how the thing is actually rolled out and implemented, that could be a way of bringing in a lot of people who actually have a good command of the subject matter, who are not certified teachers or who might be, depending, to spend time with individual kids or small groups of kids. And that I could make a very big difference very quickly.
and then the
Gotcha.
high school program to attract minority students into teaching.
Gotcha. I understand.
Sorry,
Thanks.
Rachel, you know more. You remember.
No,
Rachel, there questions
Yeah.
on this line?
Laura has her hand up.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask a question about on this teacher recruitment topic, because I do think that this is going to be a crucial topic, especially if we're talking about increasing access to early childhood education, and we just don't have the workforce right now. These high performing countries and states that you looked at, what is their model of supporting the teacher education candidates? I understand in Singapore, they're actually receiving a 60% stipend. What are the others doing? Because right now there's just an opportunity cost that these bright undergraduates are facing, that they're choosing, I think if we can fund in some way the students, that would draw them in.
I think you're asking, how do they attract some of their best high school students into teaching? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I mean, is there a mechanism that's supporting? Are they paying for their tuition? Are they being supported throughout?
It varies. In Singapore, actually, not only do they pay for the education at the college and university level of a Singapore teacher, in exchange, by the way, for a commitment in teaching in the schools
For 5 years.
for 5 years. Not only do they do that, as soon as you become a student in those teacher education programs, you are an employee of the Ministry of Education. You start making money as a teacher, and you are entitled to the benefits of teachers. It's astonishing.
In a couple of the systems also, they start the practicum a lot earlier. That gets people really excited and they don't drop out.
The most interesting thing to me about this, Betsy pointed out that in almost all of these countries, you don't get to be a teacher unless you can get into a research university. When we say that to American policymakers, they say, surely you are kidding, Mr. Tucker. We can't get people to go into teaching who can get into a third tier university that you can get into without waking up. How would we possibly attract people into the research universities? What happened in Finland when they set up a rule, in effect saying you can't be a teacher unless you can get into a research university, a very narrow funnel, something really interesting happened. The first thing is what you would expect. The kids with poor high school records looked at that and said, there's no point in applying because I'm not going to get in. So the number of poorly prepared students didn't even bother. The thing that nobody expected was that kids who thought they could become lawyers, doctors, architects, and engineers and accountants said, oh, it's hard to get into teaching now. I can get the same kind of respect for going into teaching that I could get if I was going to be an architect or an accountant or an engineer. And the fact is, I'd rather be a teacher. And so the number of kids in Finland who scored near the top of their graduating classes, the proportion of them just ballooned. So you've got that in Shanghai now. They're offering pretty big bonuses to payments to kids who want to go into teaching. What they're finding is that those payments mean, and it's exactly what you would expect. Those payments, that is the state paying for their education, for example, mean a whole lot less to kids from wealthy and majority Chinese families than they do to the kids coming from low income and minority families. And so that kind of policy, which we recommended to the commission and they adopted as a recommendation, is essentially a tool not just for getting high performing high school graduates into teaching, but high performing minority and low income kids into attracting them into teaching. All those things are true.
So if I can just add very quickly, what the commission ultimately recommended is there's a new teaching fellowship scholarship that is it has an income limit. And the funding for that is going to ramp up from $2 million to $18 million. And that is essentially, mandated permanently, until the supply of high quality teachers till we have a surplus, whatever that might be. So,
Is that in the blueprint?
Yeah.
it is.
Yep, it
Yeah,
is.
we apologize. We didn't put every single solitary recommendation because we just didn't have the time. And Rachel's definitely going to go through that in detail right at your next meeting.
If we had done that, you would have been here all night.
Rachel, are you going to call on others who have their?
Yeah. So 3 others, 4 now have their hands up. So Britt was next.
Thank you. I wanted to touch on the local versus central control. It's such an important point. And I want to draw an analogy, that we had to think very hard. And I want to draw an analogy between what this commission did and what the Thornton Commission did. The Thornton Commission, of course, back around the year 2000, was primarily looking at the dollar investment in pre-K through 12 education, and significant amount of money was put on the table, and the local districts were asked to develop plans to draw upon that money. But there was no overarching framework within which they were expected to come forth with their recommendations. And there was, according to no less than Alvin Thornton, very little accountability for these individual plans that came forth. And so the difference here is, and that was total local control. That you put a strategic plan, somebody would bless it, you get the money. Here, there's a very important balance, I think, between local control and centralization.
Mhm.
What we have now is, thanks to the five pillars of this plan, there is an overarching construct. You've got to have early childhood education. You've got to have a career ladder. You've got to have CTE. But there is authority within the local districts to respond to those requirements. They will, develop individualized responses to these five pillars of, well, four, because the AIB is not, they can't respond to that, but to these, they're going to develop their own local strategies to respond to this overarching framework that's been developed. They can't go outside that framework. They got to stay within that framework, but they have the individual autonomy to shape the plan that best fits their need. Our challenge as the AIB is going to be that what they come forth with meets the expectations of the blueprint bill. And so, Ike, I think in part, it's not like local control has been taken away,
Right.
but there's a sharing and oversight to ensure that what's developed in the local districts meets the expectations the state has set in order to get their funding. So
I think the challenge, Britt, is how we explain that so that we could differentiate
right.
between what people are concerned about versus what the recommendation actually says.
Right.
I have a little joke to share with you. The mantra in the top performing countries for the last 20 years has been, how do we provide more autonomy for the folks at the bottom and less central direction? I think what Britt just said was exactly right. What we see happening is they need less central control, and we need a little more. The idea is not to become what they have been, which they're trying to get away from. The idea is to meet in the middle somewhere that's reasonable.
Gotcha. One second. Next question.
Joe Manco.
Thanks so much for the thoughtful presentation. And I think for me, clearly this tension between the centralized control or the local control and the kind of centralization, I think was a major tension that I heard in the presentation. I think the other tension that has been kind of floating around my head, is around this idea of the systemness and the interconnectedness of all of these different areas of focus. And then I guess tempering that with the sense that when everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. So, just wanted to hear from you all how you feel like those two things balance in terms of everything being really, really critical to making this plan be successful, but at the same time understanding that oftentimes when you take on many different challenges and many different foci, then things tend to fall apart.
Oh gosh. Okay. So first of all, I like the way you express this as a tension, because I think that's how we think about it too. When you look at the plan, nobody is talking about putting all of the agencies that will be involved in implementing it, consolidating them in one agency. Nobody ever talked about that. It's a bit the way Britt talked a moment ago about local control. All of those agencies, according to the legislation, have complete operational control over the things they've always had operational control over. That's what the legislation says. It also says, however, that they are required to sit down at the table with you under your direction and figure out how what they're going to do is going to make a contribution to the results we're all looking for, that is that is aligned with the contributions that everybody else is making. And that is crucial because they've been almost totally unaligned up till now. And it's little wonder you don't get much for the buck, right? So it's again, I think the way you put it as attention is exactly right. It isn't that you're taking away what they have had in terms of operational control. No, it isn't that one big agency is going to be created that's going to consolidate all of these agencies. No, but they will for the first time be required to operate as if they were trying to seek the same end in a framework that they hold in common. That's on your first point. On your second point, our observation, well, I can put it another way. It's not as if Maryland has no early childhood program. It's not as if it doesn't have a curriculum. It's not as if it has no CTE program. For every one of these major parts of the plan, there is already something going on a pretty large scale. It's not that we're inventing a new system. So we're going to build our early childhood system, and then 6 years down the road, we're going to build something else. No, no, no. All that stuff is happening now. It has been happening for a long time. Our observation about the top performing systems is, as I said earlier, much more depends on the degree to which you are actually putting all the pieces together than it does actually on the quality standing independently of any of them. Years ago, I went to Singapore. The United States, was putting more money into instructional technology than any other country in the world. I went to Singapore to find out why they were leading the world league tables on student performance. The teachers all said to me, go to the tech center. I went to the tech center. Do you know what they had in it? VHS tapes. When we were giving computers to all the kids. Why did the teachers love it? Because what was on the tapes was stuff that was tied directly to the Singapore curriculum they were supposed to teach and enabled their kids to visualize things the teachers couldn't visualize for them. It was low technology, but it was high impact because the pieces fit together. That's the point. And we think that you all can start fitting the pieces together from day one.
Can I just say also, it's not that we didn't think about this all together as a group. Rachel's team and some of mine and APA did put together an implementation plan that lays out year by year, even month by month, what to start working on. Not all at the same time. It's impossible, Joe, like you said. You can't prioritize everything, nothing will happen. But I think we did a thoughtful job. So I think it would be worth, going back and looking at that in detail to see if we did do a good job. And also things have changed since then,
Right.
Let alone COVID.
Right.
So I do think it's a good start. Let me say that.
Yeah, and that's in the most recent version of it is in the final report. But it needs to be updated.
Yep.
For
Yep.
COVID and other things. Jennifer Lynch is next.
Hi, I have two different questions. One, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. It's has so much good information in it. I really do appreciate it and look forward to digesting it. You talked a little bit about early childhood support and how when children enter within their first couple of years, there is an increased amount of support that keeps them on track. I think most school systems would argue that they have a pretty robust intervention system. And so it's clearly not meeting all children's needs where they are, or we would be seeing more success. So in your research, what did you note was the difference between those supports in those high performing countries and what supports look like in US institutions.
Betsy?
I think the comprehensiveness of the supports is the basic answer. You know, I don't know if you noticed, we didn't mention it, that there's a huge investment in the Maryland Blueprint and community schools. And that's the whole school with a director, right? Was it a director, Rachel, for each school, bringing together the resources for that every child needs at that young age. You know, from eyeglasses, hearing, mental health, behavioral health. So that's the thing we notice the most in these top systems.
And,
That
and
the supports
Judy,
are
centric.
not just academic.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, if I may. I think one of the things that it's really, really important to keep in mind is what we said earlier about poverty in the United States versus poverty in the top performing countries. I don't want to mislead you. There is a lot of poverty in China. There's a lot of poverty in some of these other countries that are performing very well. But if you look overall at the statistics, the poverty in the average school in the United States is much greater than it is in almost all of these other countries. And the extent of concentrated poverty is without precedent anywhere else. And I fell off my bicycle 4 years ago and landed on my neck, and I landed not very long. I couldn't move anything from the neck down. They sent me to a trauma hospital, and that's when I learned about trauma. When you're in a state of trauma of the kind that many of the kids in communities with concentrated poverty are, and you're in a classroom, the chances are you're trying to figure out whether that teacher is friend or foe. You're not listening to what they're saying about reading. The problem is so much deeper than that. They had to put together a trauma team for me that watched every single wire coming out of me for 2 weeks, constantly, 24 hours a day, before they could get me to the point where they could stabilize me. And there is something very like that happens to the kids in trauma and where we see concentrated poverty in Maryland and elsewhere. In the top performing countries, they have a saying, it's the heart before the head. And what they mean by that is that in schools serving communities where there are lots of poor and minority kids in most of these Asian countries, their first job is to win the confidence of the kids, to get them to a point where they can just begin to pay attention to the instruction that is given to them. And that might take 2 to 3 years. The extent of that need is so much greater here in the United States than it is in the top performing countries, that the wraparound services combined with the extra funds going to students in communities with concentrated poverty, that is a very important part of this plan.
And the additional people in the classroom.
And the additional people in the classroom, that's right.
And time to work together as a team.
This, by the way, is one of the reasons that the commission, I thought very wisely, started to focus on, no, we're not just going to give the money to the school district and let them put it wherever they think it's most useful, which is how it now works. We're going to set this thing up so that most of the money that the district gets, because they have an unusual concentration of poverty, goes to the schools where the kids who are suffering most from an unusual concentration of poverty are. So all those things are coming together in the answer to your question.
But we don't disagree with you, Jennifer. We have so many great things going on.
We do.
Yeah. No, I was just curious as to what is the difference. And thank you, Betsy, for also talking about a little bit about the collaborative teaching and having, that time, because that's my second question, is that, your data shows great results from the time that teachers have in these top performing countries to actually do the professional development, do the work together to provide best instruction. And so my other question is, do these top performing countries, how do they balance sort of this idea of seat time and time in front of a teacher versus time for teachers to plan? How does the day look a little bit different? And was that at all considered when sort of developing the blueprint to give that critical time? You know, you talked a lot about really raising the bar, elevating teacher expertise. And we have great teachers all around the state of Maryland right now who all agree that they would like better professional development. They would like things that can really elevate their teaching. And that's like a great starting point, is to give them the time. So I'm just wondering what that looks like in other countries, how that balance is, and sort of what that consideration is in the blueprint.
Well, remember I told you that in the top performing countries, these teachers have a whole lot more time to do what you were just describing. And I said they got that time in part by, when I say a whole lot more time, it's like 40% of their time is spent not in front of classes, whereas almost all of our teachers' time is spent in front of classes when they're in. That's a giant difference. And I told you that in part, they pay for that in large part with slightly larger class sizes. Large class sizes, when you looked at the table I shared with you, showing you the flat performance and the enormous increase in cost, a very large part of the enormous increase in cost was lowering class size in the United States. Lowering class size is the single most expensive and single least helpful education reform we could possibly have embraced. And we embraced it to an extent that no other country ever has.
Can I just interject one thing? It doesn't mean that there's less people in the classroom, though. Adults.
No, not at
they
all.
actually have more teachers. Per pupil is the other variable. And in the plan, correct me if I'm wrong, Rachel, we laid out on the career ladder the hours served in front of kids, depending on where you are on the ladder. And as you move up, you have even less and less time in front of kids, and more to oversee PD, to run teams. You know, you need people to organize that, and those will be teachers.
I should say, by the way, that a lot of the time that teachers have when they don't have to be in front of kids in the United States is taking professional development.
Nice.
And what our research shows is that almost all of that is a bloody waste of money. It's almost always on somebody else's agenda. And it almost always is received by teachers as something that doesn't help them very much. There's an enormous amount of professional development that gets done in the model we were describing. But the way it gets done is in those teams that teachers are on. For example, when they decide that they really need to improve the way math is taught in the 8th grade, I'm just picking something, they'll put a team of teachers together to put together a new curriculum for the 8th grade, and they'll give them, say, a year and a half to do it. And that starts out with, remember I told you they were trained to do research. So that starts out with a subset of the team members spending something like 3 months doing a worldwide search of the literature on teaching math with that content at that grade level. It's a serious literature search. They then take what they've learned from that and they boil it down, they compare it to what they're doing, and they put a plan together. And when they put the plan together, it includes an implementation plan. Part of that implementation plan is a research design for figuring out whether what they're doing is working the way they had hoped it would in terms of producing the levels of student achievement. Because they've been given these research skills, they're able to figure that out. And so they're able to keep changing their design as they demonstrate this program to each other and observe it. So it gets better and better and better until it gets to a point where it does what they wanted it to do. And then they adopt it school-wide. That is an approach to professional development we almost never use in the United States, but it is actually the way most of us on this call work. That is to say, the professional development that we're getting all the time. We're getting it because we're reading all the time. We're observing all the time. We're talking with each other about what we've seen, and we're learning from each other. That's what professionals do. But that's not what we do with teachers. We get people who know very little about their work, telling them what they think they ought to do.
Rachel, how are we doing on the time? Because I want to take a break at some point here.
I think Mara Doss has
I'm sorry.
question, and then
yeah.
we can move on to the next section. If I can just say very quickly one thing so that nobody is confused. The commission did not, I repeat, did not adopt a recommendation to make class sizes larger.
No.
So that is what top performing systems do, and it was discussed, but it was not adopted.
More money for more people though, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Did do
More
that.
money for more teachers.
What's
But
the next question there?
Mara, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to unmute there. Again, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Betsy, for bringing the gap analysis to life. And this is a great discussion. And I have a comment, more or less, and would just like to get some of your insight. When I overviewed the recommendations and the blueprint itself, there was a nagging concern, and that was in the area of career technical education. And just as a really quick example, I attended an all Black, majority Black high school. And when I was in high school, I was counseled and advised to go on the secretary track and don't go to college. Okay. And that was vocational education back then, and that was many, many years ago. But that tracking still goes on in some way, shape, or form. And so when I read the gap analysis and in the CTE section, one of the first bullet points when we talked about the world's top performing CTE systems is that CTE is seen as a high quality pathway with both employment and post-secondary options for graduates. And then it goes on to say that training is available on a wide range of attractive careers and that the system allows for mobility. And so reading that was reassuring to my concern, and that concern is a shared concern of others that I've spoken to as well. And it was iterated throughout the gap analysis, and then again in the recommendations. So I just wanted to just quickly just hear any insight that you may have to share on that.
Well, this is an issue about which I have felt very strongly for a long, long time. The issue that you framed it so well. And I don't think a whole lot has changed since the era you're describing. As we said, there are only 9% of Maryland's kids in the career and technical education program. It is widely viewed as a dumping ground. That is the end result of the trashing of America's vocational education and training system over the last 40 years. And I remember having a conversation with an older fellow teaching career and technical education in Council Bluffs a few years back. He told me about how he had actually taught serious skills years ago, and now he was getting kids sent to him by teachers and principals because they had just given up on them. They knew no math whatsoever. He was teaching elementary school math to these kids, and very little of it. What we have, I'm going to explain this in the next section, but the core of the plan is to trash and bury America's streaming system. Our system for streaming kids into different futures in precisely the way that you described. The axis of the entire system is a plan that says, here are the standards that every single school in Maryland is responsible for getting kids to. It's going to be high, and as Betsy said earlier, you're going to achieve it, most of you, by the end of your sophomore year. And when you achieve it, it is your choice whether you go into a university track, a two-year college track, or a very high-quality vocational track. Your choice. Nobody's going to do to those kids what they did, what you were talking about. We think you're only up to being a secretary. It'll be the end of that. These kids will be so well educated, it'll be up to them. And the career and technical occupation track will be so attractive to kids that lots more kids will want to go into it because they see a way up to the top that way, which is not the case now.
Can I give you an example? But this isn't higher ed. A number of universities around the country offer co-op education. So you go to school and you work.
Yep.
This is what this should be, but at high school level. And that's why it makes it so attractive. Two things: that you have work experience already in an arena that you're interested in before you even leave high school. And then you're ready for college. You go to college if you want to. Go into the workplace, go into the military. But it's like Mark said, your choice, and you're ready. That's the goal.
You're the end of the tracking system.
Yeah. Are there any additional questions at this time, Laura?
That's it.
All right, we're going to take a 10-minute, real 10-minute break because we want to stay on schedule, and we'll come right back in 10 minutes, okay?
If you could, everybody just turn off your video and mute and make sure you're muted, and we'll see you in 10 minutes.
Oh, yikes. Why? What's going on?
Well, we can hear you talking, Mark.
What's wrong, Mark?
Oh, I can hear you now. I have no idea why I couldn't, but there you are. Excellent. I'm sorry. I was, I must have been computer illiterate for a moment.
No problem. We're still waiting on a,
Oh, there we go.
there we go. We have everybody.
Excellent. All right.
So let me share my screen.
Everybody ready?
Great. So,
There we go.
super.
Okay.
All right. So we are in the third and next to last section of our whole afternoon's program. And this is where we take a look at the whole design from a set of different perspectives that we think are particularly important. Next slide. We come to the heart of the matter, and it is exactly where we just ended the last conversation we had. The heart of the matter, in our view, is the system for college and career readiness. And why is it the heart of the matter? When the goals of the system, when the goals of the system are met, Maryland students are going to be performing at world-class levels. There are going to be many more prepared to attend world-class universities. Many are actually going to wind up getting an associate's degree with their high school diploma when they graduate high school. And many others will have a solid start on a rewarding career in a technical field. The whole system is going to be much more efficient, so the public will get more for its money. Oops. Why can't, oh, I'm sorry. So would you advance it? The aim is the one we were just talking about. The aim is to get the vast majority of Maryland students to a standard in mathematics and reading that will give them a high probability of succeeding in the first year of a 2-year or 4-year college program. And here are the italics, by the end of their sophomore year in high school. It is reaching that standard that leaves them 2 years to do everything I talked about in the preceding slide. When they reach that standard, they'll be able to choose among any of the following: a full international baccalaureate program, a program made up entirely, if they want, of advanced placement courses, or a full University of Cambridge International General Certificate of Secondary Education program. All of these are available in English. All of them would be available to you to use in Maryland. And if you successfully complete these programs, the students who successfully completed them would find that they would be looked on with favor by the admissions officers in leading universities all over the world. And the system would have been designed so that they would be prepared to do exactly that. The second big option they would have is to get a full associate's degree program in high school at no additional expense to the parents or the kids. And the third one would be a demanding 2-year technical education program resulting in an industry recognized credential. And when I say an industry recognized credential, I don't mean a CPR certificate that you could get in 3 days. I mean a kind and quality of career education that would give you the entree to polytechnic universities, if that's where the kids wanted to go, or into a union program for electricians and plumbers, and many, many, many other opportunities that are very exciting. Next slide. These are the outcomes that the entire system, which we have been talking with you about, has been designed to achieve. The legislation specifies the procedure that the Department of Education has to use to set the CCR standards. To get to those outcomes, Maryland needs to backward map from the CCR system goals and standards to develop a set of experiences for student trajectories from grade 1 through high school. For that to work, what you have to end up with is what the educators call a set of curriculum frameworks, which specify, in effect, the developmental program for moving through the discipline from first grade to the standard I just talked about being set. When that's done, Maryland teachers will need to develop curriculum for their school and their students that will enable them to get on that trajectory at the beginning of grade 1 and stay on it until they master this curriculum and achieve those standards. The entire system, and this is really why it is the heart of the matter, the entire system will have to be designed and managed to give them the resources they will need to succeed. And as I said a moment ago, this actually is the antithesis of the system we have had since the 1930s, the streaming system that we just talked about, the tracking system that we just talked about, the assignment of kids to roles in our society by teachers and principals when kids are in grade 7 or 8 or earlier. It would end all that. So next slide, please. The legislation redesigns the whole Maryland system for career and technical education, shifting its governance from the Department of Education. The point here, by the way, is that this is not just an academic system redesigned. It is the whole curriculum. It is academics, and it is applied learning. It is curriculum and technical. It is the whole shooting match. So the legislation redesigns the whole Maryland system for career and technical education, shifting the governance, and this is really important, it's shifting its governance from the Department of Education to the Governor's Workforce Board, which is intended to give employers the primary voice in the design of the system, and to connect, which, as Betsy told you earlier, is what we see in every country that has a successful CTE program. It is not driven by the educators. It is driven by the employers, and it's driven by the people who are responsible for the economic and workforce development programs of the state, the province, or the country. The Workforce Board is empowered to set occupational standards and to organize a system for the widespread provision of opportunities for students to acquire strong technical skills in Maryland workplaces under conditions that will protect both the students and the employers. That whole bullet is exactly one sentence. But what has to be done to set up a system that will accomplish that is very complex. And it's laid out in the legislation. Next slide, please. As the plan is implemented, more students get their associate degrees in high school that they now get if they go to a community college 2 years into community college. And they get opportunities to get forms of career and technical education in high school that they now get in Maryland community colleges. Then the community colleges will have to change their roles with programs less like the high schools in the top performing countries and a lot more like the programs of their academic colleges and polytechnics in the top performing countries. In other words, although what you are about is on its face about elementary and secondary education, it has enormous implications for the organization and program of higher education. So the AIB will need to work closely with the Department of Education, the Higher Education Board, and the Governor's Workforce Board to align and coordinate their evolving development. Next slide, please. This is another one of the 5 most important. There is no separate inequity initiative in the blueprint. The whole plan is designed to make education more equitable in Maryland, every part of it. The CCR design abolishes the tracking system, as I said. Nothing could be more important for setting up a true equity system in Maryland. Second, it establishes a high standard for all students. And thirdly, it redesigns the system to enable all students to achieve that standard. It's the opposite of the sorting system we've had since the 30s. Here is another rather important point. Even students who fail to achieve the CCR until they graduate would be achieving, these are kids who typically drop out now or come out achieving very little. Even students who fail to achieve the CCR until they graduate will be achieving a standard that is now attained by fewer than half of today's high school graduates. Next slide. The following features of the blueprint are key to improving equity. Right when we shared this list with Rachel the other day, she said this sounds a little like a laundry list, and it shouldn't. And Rachel was quite right about that. It will sound a little bit like a laundry list, but it is basically illustrative. And what it illustrates is how the equity principle has penetrated every single part of this report and lies at its foundation. So among the things that you will see as you page through the report is that the Commission has created a new weight in the funding formula for students living in concentrated poverty. Did not exist before. Greatly expands the Judy Centers and the Family Support Centers. As Betsy said, they do a good job, and they do a job that's very important to be done, but they're serving a small fraction of the kids who actually need it. It provides a big increase in funding for community schools to provide wraparound services, to handle everything, as I was saying earlier, from trauma to kids who just disappear from the system. Establish a large new tutoring program. So as we were saying to Ike earlier, you guys can get off to a flying start delivering services to kids who are desperately needed, not least because of what has happened because of COVID. Big increase in funding for special education. Next slide, please. There are other blueprint features that support equity. It provides new incentives to attract a very diverse group of top performing high school students to teaching, as I said earlier, on the condition that they agree to serve for a specified period in schools serving students in low income, mostly minority schools. I've sat in the back of classes serving minority and low income schools all over the United States and heard teachers in front of those kids telling them stuff about mathematics, elementary mathematics, arithmetic. It's simply not true. If we can get this to happen, that will stop. Create a much better system for catching students who are falling behind much earlier and giving teachers more time to spend with those students. Institute measures to greatly reduce the need to label as special education students the students who have no identifiable physical or cognitive impairments. As Betsy was saying earlier, our teachers all over the country, many of them are at their wits' end because fewer and fewer kids have been going into teaching, so the teachers' jobs have been getting harder and harder. And with COVID, for many teachers, that's going right over the edge. And when you're doing that and you're teaching to the middle of the class and there are 6 kids who are acting out, you just feel you can't deal with it at all unless you can get those 6 kids somewhere else. And the result of that is that more than half the kids who are assigned as special education kids have no identifiable physical or cognitive impairments. They just need help. They need help to deal with the environments they find themselves in. Next slide, please. Provide new funds for parents to access high quality, affordable childcare and early childhood education, all those things that Betsy was talking about. Transform the state's career and technical education system from a dead end and for many students into an opportunity to acquire the skills they need to begin a rewarding career. The dumping ground will be turned into an opportunity ground for kids who desperately need it. Make it possible for high school students to leave high school with an associate's degree at no cost to the family while living at home. Wouldn't that be great? Next slide. Require that funds allocated to the districts on the basis of the needs of high-risk students actually get to those students by tracking those funds to the schools they actually attend. Providing extended learning time and one-to-one instruction to students who need it to achieve to high standards. So if in first grade, these kids aren't reading well, they come in early, they stay late, they come in on Saturday, they get help all through the summer. We have a system now in which the standards remain constant, in which the standard, the amount of time that the kids get in school is constant. So the standards that they reach varies. What this is a system where the standards will be high and constant, but the amount of time that they have to achieve them varies. Totally different system. Create in the AIB a powerful accountability system designed to make sure that all these features of the system are actually implemented. As Britt said earlier, a system that is designed to help kids, that is designed to be focused on equity, as Thornton was, is absolutely thwarted if you don't. The Commission did not choose between excellence and equity. It's designed to deliver both. Next. I mentioned COVID a moment ago. We've heard that people in Maryland have suggested that COVID has led to a crisis in the schools, which it certainly has, that should take a higher priority than implementing the blueprint. That assumes that addressing the COVID problem is quite different from implementing the blueprint, but nothing could be further from the truth. Maryland government needs to help the public better understand how the blueprint addresses the issue of equity. COVID laid bare the very kind of problems the blueprint is intended to address. The blueprint's enveloping concern for equity led it to propose the very kinds of measures that are going to be needed to address the devastation caused by the virus. Next slide, please. Half of Maryland students did not attend school during COVID, making the state the 6th lowest in the nation in the proportion of students attending school. Maryland students fail their courses at somewhere between 2 to 3 times the rate during COVID than previous to COVID. High school students failed at rates about 800% higher than before for math and 300% higher for science. The Baltimore Sun estimates that 27,000 students, particularly at-risk students, just dropped out. Next. Maryland needs to find the students who dropped out, and it needs to get them back in school. When they are back in school, what they're going to need is all of the measures we just went through, all of the measures just described as equity features of the blueprint. From intensive tutoring to extended learning time, to wraparound support, to great teachers, to funding that's targeted to them and their needs. That's what they're going to need. Next. So let's come back to school finance. I shared some funding features actually what I did was share some comparisons of the way our schools are funded to the way schools are funded in the top performing countries. This is a slightly different issue. We need to go back in time to understand it. American and Maryland's school finance system what it is now and has been for a long time, originated in the 1970s. It grew out of the civil rights movement. It was based on the provision in most state constitutions requiring the state to provide an adequate education to its citizens. Cases started to develop, pushed by lawyers from advocacy firms, thank God, that established that the courts could compel them to do that. That is, could compel the state to provide an adequate education. Whether or not funding is adequate has been established by convening panels of educators who opine about how much money would be required to provide a program for schools serving students from a variety of backgrounds to get them to a set of standards specified by the state. Legislatures rely on that estimate to set and contest state education budgets. Next slide. That sounds scientific, but actually it's anything but. There isn't any research that reveals how all students can get to the standards that states typically aspire to. If there had been such research and it had been well performed, states would be doing it, and state performance would be much better than it is. You saw what it was, flat. So state education budgets keep going up, but the performance does not. There's another problem with the way this is done. Legislatures use the standard method. This is what Britt was talking about when he was talking about the Thornton report. Legislators use the standard method to figure out how much money should be appropriated. Then they give it to school districts using their formula. But the districts use it any way they want to. So there's usually no relationship between how the amount was calculated and how it's spent. Next slide. That was the problem with Thornton. The Thornton Commission, as Britt told you, asked for a big increase in funding over many years. Educators, when a recession came, and the amount was cut some, the educators complained when funds were cut. But the increase in funding was still far in excess of inflation. And predictably, the improvement in student performance, as Britt told you, was marginal. I think it understates the case to say that the commission was determined not to do this again. The question, of course, is what the alternative is. The alternative was embedded in the charge given to the Kirwan Commission to identify in detail the strategies used by the global top performers to get to the top, and then cost out what it would cost Maryland to implement those changes. Next slide. This approach to costing is far more scientific than the methods the courts have actually been using. It is actually exactly what the commission did. But as Thornton learned, to make this funding strategy work, the state has to make sure that Maryland's version of the strategies used by the top performers is actually implemented. Not just to figure out how much should be appropriated at the top level. It should be used to make policy and set practice in every district and every school in Maryland. Next slide. For more than 20 years, accountability in the United States has meant threatening schools with takeovers and teachers with firing if their teachers failed to meet state targets for student performance. That all makes sense if you believe that the educators knew all along what they needed to do for their students, but didn't have enough incentives, strong enough incentives to do it. It also assumes that every teacher is alone responsible for the achievement of the students in his or her class, but neither of these things is remotely true. It didn't work. We found that no top performer has accountabilities that are anything like what the United States has embraced over the last 20 years. Next slide. The top performers actually don't need our kind of measure and punish accountability systems because they have the kind of governance structure that I described earlier. The ministry, and it is the ministry, takes years, not a few hearings, to plan ahead. They involve a wide swath of advocates, stakeholders, and experts when they do that. And that results in broad ownership of the new goals and the strategies for reaching them, ownership that usually transcends changes in political leadership. Real change requires deep transformation in culture. It's not just the implementation of the letter of the law. It requires deep transformation in culture. And that's what this long gestation process produces. Next slide. And here's the big difference. This gets back to what we were talking about earlier with respect to the local control versus having a ministry. In those countries, what happens next happens because the ministry owns the whole system. So it can make sure that every agency with a role to play plays that role. And it makes sure that the tools and the training that everyone at every level will need to be successful are developed and used. It monitors agencies that are subordinate agencies to make sure that the guidance they issue and the criteria that they use for granting funds are consistent with the legislation. It makes extended visits to schools to gauge whether the policies and practices that are supposed to be implemented are in fact being implemented on the ground where it counts. If that's not the case, they ensure that the schools get the help they need to fully implement the new policies and practices. Next slide. At the policy level, the ministry gathers a lot of data and sponsors a lot of research to monitor implementation at scale and judge whether the new policies are having the desired effect. And if, as time goes by, the emerging data show that changes in policy are needed to reach the original goals, the minister goes back to the prime minister, and the legislature to request those changes. At the same time, the ministry is benchmarking what the top performers are doing to improve their performance, and they're incorporating what they learn in their operations. Next slide. Well, of course, there is no agency in Maryland government that has the authority and mandates to do what was just described. The Kirwan Commission took 3 years to produce this report, doing far more research than is usually done and consulting far more widely throughout the state than is usual in American policymaking. It was behaving like a ministry. But that is only the beginning of the often decades-long process that was just described. The commission proposed that the AIB be created to take on the roles that a high-level agency of government would routinely take on in the implementation of a major new plan of this sort in the top performing countries. Next slide. So once again, why is a new agency needed? Why can't the State Board of Education and the State Department of Education take on all these tasks? Well, successful implementation depends on the tightly coordinated action of many bodies in many branches of state and local government. The Department of Education is only one of those agencies. Next slide. The AIB was structured as a powerful agency with powers to approve agency plans, grant announcement criteria, awards of funds, and other functions related to implementation of the blueprint. But the AIB is not intended, as I said earlier, to take over agency operations. Its job is to make sure that the agencies work together to carry out their assigned role in the blueprint. The AIB's powers provide a strong incentive to the agencies to seek the AIB's advice and meet its expectations. If you think that your grant guidelines aren't going to meet the approval of the AIB, you aren't going to wait until the very last minute to find out. You're going to sit down and work with the AIB to make sure they are approved when they are formally presented. And that's true for every other piece of this. Next slide. Legislation spells out the metrics and the indicators that the agencies have to collect and issue reports on. AIB is authorized to to commission experts to do outside reviews and conduct analyses of blueprint operations and progress. While the AIB is the institutional guarantor of fidelity to the blueprint, the CCR system was designed as the focus of accountability for all the actors. Next slide. Primary focus of the metrics. This is about the bottom line for you all. It's in the last analysis, it's you choosing what you're going to be held accountable for and setting up a system to make sure you can be and you'll be successful. So the primary focus of the metrics used by the AIB, the data collected by the AIB and the reports it issues, and on implementation and the results should be the metrics of the CCR system. Here's what I mean by that. How many high school students, school by school and district by district, broken down by race, ethnicity, gender, and parental income, are achieving CCR by the end of their sophomore year? How many by the time they leave high school? How many in the lower grades are getting on a pathway that will get them to CCR by the end of the sophomore year? Next. How many of those who are getting to CCR by the end of their sophomore year are selecting and successfully completing the options available to them? How do differences in implementation of the components of the blueprint affect the degree to which students of different backgrounds in different schools, in different school systems, get on track to achieve CCR by the end of their sophomore year? How does the system need to be changed to improve the prospects of all students for getting to CCR by the end of their sophomore year and for successfully completing one of the options that would then be available to them? Next. A relentless, by which I actually mean relentless, focus on these and similar questions should drive the AIB's approach to its role as keeper of the blueprint flame. The AIB is authorized to withhold funds from schools that fail at the beginning of implementation to file plans that are consistent with the blueprint or later fail to implement such plans. But this was not done to save money. And it certainly wasn't done to deny needy students the resources they need to succeed. It was done to provide a strong incentives to these schools to do what is necessary for their students to succeed. Those incentives have to come with help that you organize. Next slide. The blueprint requires the Department of Education to assemble review teams composed of expert educators who are going to visit the schools, especially those with statistics suggesting poor performance. They're there to assess the reasons for that poor performance and to propose remedies and provide guidance for assistance that the district and the state can use to provide the help that the schools need to qualify for the escrowed funds, including recommendations that the school be required to fully implement a state curriculum designed to provide the support that students need to get on the CCR trajectory and stay there. In essence, what we're saying here is you come up with a curriculum that you think meets these kids' needs and are going to get them there. But if it's not doing that, you'll have to use our curriculum, meaning the state curriculum. Next slide. The biggest danger in this whole system is that it becomes accountability simply for compliance. Regulatory agencies tend to become just compliance agencies very quickly. From our point of view, if that happens, the spirit of the blueprint is lost. The AIB is not meant to be a compliance machine. It is responsible for creating a culture that fully supports the strategies underlying the blueprint, a culture that is shared throughout the system. It can provide incentives for people to do the right thing. It certainly should, but it cannot make people do what is needed. They have to want to do it, and to want to do it, they have to be convinced that it's the right thing. To fully implement the blueprint, the AIB has to help all of the participants see why it is necessary, and they have to make sure that they have all the help they need to make it work. Next slide. There we are. Back to you and your questions.
If we take the AIB's role, and I'm a little bit puzzled on one side, because there's a political side of this and the aspect of my knowing the state fairly well, that we have inconsistencies around the state. Unless there's a firm requirement that, at least in principle, has some level of potential enforceability, it is likely that you are to get some reluctance, non-compliance, delays, what have you. And you end up with the sort of Ali rope-a-dope kind of thing. You're not throwing in the towel, but you're not really fighting. And, you know, these people will be here for a while and we're just gonna wait them out and go back to business as usual. And so if there's no real potential threat, which I agree with you, that should not be the first weapon out of the box. Our goal should be that we're able to work with, coordinate, and do all of this together in the spirit of cooperation. I think if we get to the point that we are even suggesting that we're taking monies away from people or withholding funds,
Right.
then there's a failure somewhere. We've had a failure. And that's not where I want to go. But on the other side, I don't want to see us in a situation where we are have a rope-a-dope. Well, they're going to be here for a period of time. The General Assembly leaders will change. There's possibly new leadership at the state level. Let's just rope-a-dope these people a while because we know what is best. And we just don't want to fully comply in the way that's right. So to me, that's the potential dilemma there, and not believing that the hammer might come down may be a potential for simply being roped it up.
I think we are in violent agreement. I agree with
violent agreement.
Violent agreement. I think we are in violent agreement. I agree with every single word you said. I pointed out somewhere in there that enormous powers have been given to the AIB. And you had better believe that our team at NCEE was 1000% in favor of that. And did not think that this is going to succeed without you having those powers. But I think what I was saying, in effect, was something like what you were saying when Theodore Roosevelt said that his policy was to walk softly and carry a big stick.
Big stick, yeah.
If the big stick is out there all the time, and all you care about is the stick, then it becomes a compliance agency. And what you end up with is people out there with checklists. Check, 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 check. And they move on. And so I totally agree with you that I think those schools have got to understand that if they rope-a-dope the State Department of Education, the State Department is not in a position to say, well, that's okay. That's okay. You've done the best you can get in the circumstances, because they are going to have to understand that the State Department of Education is going to be in a position to make a recommendation, but it's the AIB that's going to decide whether they get that money. And they're not going to get that money until the AIB is convinced that they actually have a plan that the staff of that school is behind and wasn't written by a professional proposal writer, right? That stands a good chance of working. And I think what I was trying to say is, if you put everything on the stick, you've probably made a mistake, because the way to handle that situation with this big stick right behind your back so they can see it sticking up above your head, right? The way to handle that situation is knowing knowing that they're going to have to produce or else, is for you with the other hand out to say, and we're going to help you get there. We're going to help you get there. Our aim is not to deny you the money, but you're not going to get it until you meet the standard. And here's a whole lot of help to meet that standard. We won't write the proposal for you, but we will show you, we'll lead you to people, we'll lead you to stuff you can read, we'll lead you to people who know you and your situation, who will help you and your staff put together a proposal that will meet the standard. So it's what you were saying. It's Teddy Roosevelt's rule. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, okay. Bye.
Okay.
Joe Manco has a question.
Yeah, I mean, this more or less piggybacks off of the last question, but maybe moves away from the idea of accountability. But, you know, to me, it seems like in order for this to be effective, you need to develop a deep sense of ownership and responsibility amongst those who are implementing. And I think that overall is the name of the game. And I guess the question to you is, how recommendations, just initially your thoughts on how that gets done, especially at like such a large scale. You know, like I think working at a school, it's already, you know, it has been, you know, hard enough just getting, you know, really, really solid alignment amongst the, you know, 28 teachers on my staff. To do this at a scale that is statewide and to get people to buy in and own what you are working on, and, you know, everybody working on one accord seems like a very, very large challenge. So just leaning on your expertise and ideas on that, how to generate that sense of ownership and responsibility amongst everybody throughout the state.
I'll have more to say about that in a minute when we get to the last piece of this, but your question is absolutely right on the money. We put together this enormous slide deck in part to help you answer that question. When we actually thought about it, there was no document anywhere that laid out in detail the rationale behind the report, the argument to be made for it in this way, all in one place. The way I tried to describe earlier what the top performers do. I mean, the folks, the people who did the reforms in Hong Kong are very good friends. One of them was the leader in China of one of the biggest banks in the world, and another was a leading educator who's in demand all over Asia. They spent 2 years putting their plan together, and they met with 2,000 different groups all over Hong Kong when they did that, over and over and over and over again, asking, what do you think's wrong with the system? Here are our ideas. What do you think of them? And all the rest of it. To do exactly what you just talked about, to build a level and kind of support for the reforms which have now outlasted even the changes in governance in Hong Kong that all of us are grimly aware of. So I'll share with you in a few minutes some things I think you can do, but I think that the way we typically do this in the United States is we hand the legislation to the agency head and say it's up to you to implement it. I don't think you can do that. I think you have to organize sessions for people at every level of most of these agencies, like this one. They're going to have to get at least as far into what this whole thing is about as you have been doing in these 4 hours.
Just to remind everyone, though, I think there's still funds that were unspent that we all had developed a plan to at least start with communicating to the 24 county superintendents.
Yep, that's right.
What Joe's saying, you know, they have to be sold this.
Yes, they
They have
do.
to believe it. You know, right now, you know, they're COVID focused, but, you know, they might need a little break from that. So I would suggest strongly that at least that's the minimum. And then I think the plan was to have all the principals have presentations to them too,
Yep.
where they have time to ask questions and to really think it through together. I mean, that was all supposed to have been done, I believe, a year and a half ago.
Right. And
So basically training.
but there
well,
will be
basically
money.
training.
There is money for the training
Yeah.
when there is money.
Right, right.
You know,
And I think we laid out sort of a agenda for that too. So.
there is a culture out there that is so deeply embedded in it. I think it all really developed when the big federal programs came in the mid 1960s. And I just illustrate the point with one little story. Lyndon Johnson passed the Great Society legislation. It included an enormous increase in money for elementary and secondary schools with as much as he could, which as much as he could was directed at low income and minority kids. And I think it was 2 years out, 3 years out, they hired they hired the Rand Corporation to they hired somebody else, that's right, to find out what big changes had taken place as a result of this enormous infusion of money. And the very well-known research and evaluation company they hired and came back and reported none. They couldn't find any changes. And then the government hired the Rand Corporation to find out why. And what the Rand Corporation found out, I still have the 5 volumes of their study. What the Rand Corporation found out was that when the money was appropriated by the Congress, and after the legislation had been passed, the Department of Education, it was then the Office of Education, issued a set of guidelines for the states to get the money to the schools. And what the Rand Corporation reported was that what the districts, not the schools, what the districts then did was go out and hire professional proposal writers to write proposals to get the money, to follow the guidelines, which they did. They followed all the guidelines. They said all the right stuff. And then what the Rand Corporation found out was when the money actually came to the schools, nobody in the schools had they knew nothing about the program. They knew nothing about what had been promised, and they thought it was all absurd. And so they just kind of worked things out. It was the rope-a-dope that Ike was talking about, right? Where there would be these forms and these checklists, and they would check them off, and everybody would wink. So the money would continue flowing, but nothing changed. Which is why now, 50 years later, the performance of those kids has not changed.
Shades of Thornton.
Yeah, no, the whole country has gone through with Thornton. It wasn't just Thornton. It was the whole bloody country.
But I don't think we should lose Joe's point, which is there has to be an active, rigorous, and comprehensive leadership. It's a leadership development effort.
Well,
using the blueprint as the curriculum. And I think, unless I agree with him totally, that if they don't buy in, this isn't going to work. So.
Yeah, no, I mean,
and the funds are there. So that's it, Mark.
No, I mean, that was well said. It just seems to me the point of this is what had not happened. It's what we were just talking about, what Betsy just said. The federal government had never mounted an effort to help teachers all over the country understand what the purpose of this program was, what was expected of them. No help had ever been offered to anybody out there to actually change what they were doing. So they thought the whole thing wasn't about changing what they were doing. It was about hiring professional proposal writers who have made a very good living.
Just also a reminder that there's, again, when there is funding for technical assistance to be provided by the blueprint to the school systems, to the state agencies and entities to help them, not write the plan for them or pay someone else to write the plan for them, but to link them up with the resources they need to be able to do it.
Just like Jennifer had asked about, could you give us examples of what a school day in totally transformed work organization where the teachers have time to do all the things we talked about. Looks like there's reports out on that, on how others do it. Of course, you can't just copy it for, schools in Maryland, but at least the resources there that could be provided easily.
Right.
Mr. Chair, are we ready to move on to the last?
Yes. Yeah, the other question, let's move on there.
All right.
Okay. We talked about, and you showed the slide for the college and career readiness being the heart of the matter. And we talked about some of that as far as the CTE and so forth, and the Governor's Workforce Board actually governing that area. And just going to kind of go back just a little bit to what Joe said, and the word ownership just stuck out because there is a continuing ownership here that there's a piece that I'm not seeing as clearly to accommodate the student who achieves the CCR standard and chooses to pursue a pathway, any of those pathways that include continuing study at a community college or public university. And this indicates an increased partnership with school districts and the post-secondary institutions. And in Prince George's County, we created the first middle college high school in 2011, which brought in students in high school when they earned their associate's degree while they're in high school without any cost to the student. And just opening that one middle college took a tremendous effort between the community college and the school district. And so what I'm not really clear on how that is going to be brought in and the transferring to the four-year public institutions. And the four-year public institutions actually revising some of their acceptance and transfer. I see this all as closing the loop. We want the student to be college and career ready, but we still want them to actually get into the college and move on. So I see that as an important piece in there. And like, how do we bring that in? How do we make sure that our public 2 years and 4 years are engaged in this as well? Because they're going to have to change their operations and practices and improve partnerships.
That is a great question. I think I really admire what you were able to do in Prince George's County. The middle college is a terrific idea, and when it works, it is bloody fabulous. There are very few of them that actually work right in the United States because it is so bloody hard to do, and it is bloody hard to do because none of our structures facilitate it. They work against it. The law, the regulations, the fact that the agencies are independent, they get their money through different forms. I mean, you have all these arguments about if you do community college or any kind of college in high school, how does the money flow? Who gets the money, right? Because you've saved an enormous amount of money, but whose money have you saved and where does it go? If you have to work all that out locally, there just aren't a whole lot of people who want to go to that kind of trouble, get into those kinds of rows and all of that. So my answer to your question is, that's your job. Your job is to get the higher education people to sit down at the table with the school people and say, how are we going to do this? So Prince George's doesn't have to do it for itself. You change the rules. So it's then easy for people to do what we were describing and not bloody hard. Instead of having to overcome all the rules in the system and their structures, the system and the structures are set up to do this. The county can't do that by itself. Or I shouldn't say can't, you did. But it's really hard. And it's hard to keep it together after you've started it. It's very easy for the system to go back to the way it was. So to me, what you've done is illustrate what your job is. It's building the system by involving at the agency level the people who have the power to change the system.
And one thing the AIB can certainly do is look at best practice statewide for all of these things
Yep, that's
where
right.
the counties are ahead of another to
Yep.
bring this together to teach the others.
Yeah, if they have a good solution, let everybody else look at it.
And then there's one more question that I see, Fagan Harris.
Thank you so much for this presentation today and all the work that's gone into it. I really, really appreciate it. It's been really, really helpful. Something that keeps jumping out to me, and I'm also going to go back to Joe Manco's point earlier and hopefully build on it a bit. It seems to me that we've got to be as preoccupied with what to do as how to do it, because this is a whole new muscle for our state, for our education system, for the culture of education, not just here in Maryland, but across the United States.
Right.
I'm reminded of the old adage that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like it applies here. Just to reflect back for a minute, and then I have a few specific questions. It seems like from a process point of view, the trust building piece is paramount, because without trust, we will not have the buy-in necessary to make the changes that we need to see. Shifting the culture at a district level, but also across our schools and even in our communities, is a second and important step. And then a third step that I think is implied by one of your slides, but I think is worth making explicit, is that this is going to be iterative. We are going to get results and feedback that are going to force us to make changes at a policy level and then at an operational and priorities level. And I think we have to be okay with that. And I think we have to name that in the spirit of constant improvement and a commitment to quality, that we won't be able to wave a wand and get there overnight, but rather we're going to have to build the trust, shift the culture, and then work very hard together for a very long time in an iterative fashion to begin to move the needle on some of these things that we've identified as priority. And so with that as context, I would be curious to hear more, and maybe this is better done offline or in a subsequent session, or you have the raw data. What are the process metrics that we need to pay attention to as an AIB? Not just the content metrics that we want to do this, that, or the other, but from a process point of view, what's best practice? How do we think about staging and phasing in our strategies so that when we do these things, we are doing them in a way that is stage appropriate? I'd imagine some of these stages, and this goes back to the point Ike made earlier, some things should be done on day one. Some things aren't going to be ready to be done until day 1000, and that we need to build cumulatively to that. And so what research or guidance do we have on how to stage and phase these strategies? And then what examples do we have on the composition of leadership and staff, given the absolute vitality of the team that's going to be assembled around that? I'm intrigued by this kind of minister model and, the requisite background of the people at all levels of the bureaucracy to make this work. It seems like that's going to be instrumental back to the initial points of building trust and evolving culture. Last thing I'll say, not a question, but just an observation. It seems like we'll also have to be mindful that there will be particular circumstances, particular facts in local jurisdictions that are going to require bespoke solutions. The realities facing Black and brown kids in urban and rural districts may require us to do things differently in those places. And while I certainly love and appreciate that equity is baked into this, I think we have to make sure that equity, being a universal principle, doesn't create blind spots for us to some of the particular experiences going on in our state. Thank you.
Can I interrupt just 1 second? Because what you just identified is such an important issue that in order for all of us to fully grasp that in its entirety, I don't think today would do justice to your question and to the comments that were made associated with that. My view would be to wrap that entire comment that you made as part of the next discussion, which I think will fully address that, because that is too important for us to simply wish by in the portions of the time that we have today, because it goes to the heart of a large number of things that we're going to have to look at and consider down the line. So rather than to answer that today, I want that as a separate standalone item incorporated into the next discussion that we'll have, so that we will have the proper time to address your excellent question and comment.
all I can do is endorse that statement. I thought to go fast, go alone, to go far, go together. Man, that sums up an awful lot of what's in our head by way of our advice to you. Your sense of what the task is, I thought was brilliantly expressed. I can't improve on it. The questions that you're asking are just a terrific summary of the ones we think you face. We've thought a lot about them. Which is not to say that we have the answers, but it's a conversation we would love to have with you.
Well, I don't want to have it today because we won't do
No.
justice.
No. I totally agree with you.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's an agenda for a long conversation. That is not 10 minutes. Not at all. Okay.
All right. Are we ready to do the
Yes.
last part? Okay. One sec.
Yeah, we're
By
doing-
the way, did we get that question recorded? Was that recorded? I hate
Yes.
to have to go back and say it all over again. Okay, then.
It's all recorded.
All right, then. Thank you.
There you go.
Okay, here we are. Your role. Let's roll on to the next slide. There will indeed be more discussion at a future meeting about what's in the blueprint, including your role. And we did not think it useful or appropriate for us here to do a detailed description of your goal as we see it. What we want to do here is to convey some observations about how we view your responsibilities from our perspective as an authority on how other nations do these things. Next slide. Apart from getting staffed and organized, two things that you just referred to in terms that have been very much in our heads. Your first and crucially important responsibility is to lead all of the relevant agencies, and I list them here, in the development of a multi-year detailed implementation plan for the blueprint. Next slide. The plan, as you know, is to be updated annually and made public. It's supposed to be faithful to the blueprint, represent a coherent, integrated, and aligned program of activities. And every component of that plan is supposed to be approved by you. It isn't just a management tool. It is, as was just said, an opportunity to build a culture of understanding and support into the agencies that will be responsible for implementing it. That's the heart of the matter. You're going to have to do for them what we are hoping we are doing here for you today. Next slide. Many people in the state and local agencies are going to need to understand not only what they're expected to do, that's part of a compliance system, but why it's important to do it, how their work fits into the whole. The plan itself is going to have to be designed to build support for the blueprint outside state government as well as inside state government. One aspect of that is making sure that in addition to sequencing the actions, another point you just made, in addition to sequencing the actions to be taken in a logical progression, each step is laying the foundation for the next. And actions taken early will produce successes that can build broad support later. Next slide. As we pointed out above, the top performers, they don't rush the process. It's a process that few education authorities in the United States actually ever engage in, and when they do, they rush it. You need to get the plan right because it will set the tone and build the base for everything that follows in all the ways that were just described. You have been created as a very powerful agency of state government You can override legislated functions of all the agencies that will be responsible for all the operational activities under the blueprint. And you will be tempted, I suspect, to usurp their operational functions when the going gets tough. Next slide. We urge you to resist that temptation. If you don't, you're going to become one of those agencies yourself. You're going to get bogged down in the mechanics of implementation, and you won't have the resources to do it well, and you'll fail. It's better to remain relatively small. You will have to develop a highly capable team, another one of the points just made, and use them to get others to do the work that you organize and ask them to do. In that vein, the legislation gives you the authority and the resources to engage others to collect the data, do all kinds of analysis, share their expertise, share their views. Your job is to figure out what kinds of data, what kinds of analysis, what kinds of expertise you need, and most important, get the right people to do it, and then figure out what it means when you get it. Next slide. You'll need to understand how the agencies at every level actually work, where their key process points are as they do that work. You have all the authority that you need to intervene at those points to make sure that they are doing what they need to do. But in order to exercise that authority, you have to know what those points are. That includes approving budgets, grant announcements, release of funds, and lots more. If you find yourself faced with having to confront all these agencies frequently, that you are at loggerheads at these touch points, you're quite likely to make a growing number of enemies. Better to let them know what you're looking for in advance and help them get there. Don't waive the standards 1 inch, 1 micromillimeter, but try to do it in a way that will get them to be your partners, not your enemies. Next slide. Because implementation is going to take at least 10 years, you'll have to give much thought to building and maintaining strong public support for the blueprint.
I think you want to say because full implementation.
That is exactly right. Yep. I stand completely corrected.
All right.
That's right. Because full implementation will take at least 4 years. 10 years, you're going to have to give a lot of thought to building and maintaining strong public support for the blueprint. That means from one administration to the next, through many changes in faces and many changes in administrations. The enormous effort that Britt made to inform countless stakeholders of what the commission was doing, to seek input from them and to bring them into the fold, needs to be continued by you. It would be wrong to think about this as a public relations program. It means real involvement. People have to feel involved. They have to be involved. And careful attention to planning for early successes, as I said earlier, that can be used to build public support for the next phase. Next slide. You'll know, I think, that you have succeeded when the number of students aggregated and disaggregated getting the CCR by the end of their sophomore year are going up year after year. And increasing numbers of them are going on to get through the demanding college prep programs the state is going to offer. They're getting their associate's degrees and they're completing demanding career and technical education programs. You will also know that you're succeeding when the cream of the crop of your high school graduates decide they want to be teachers. And you are producing, for the first time, a surplus of first-rate teachers. Next slide. And finally, you're going to know if you've succeeded when the numbers show that you've made it possible to greatly increase the proportion of highly educated Marylanders and just as greatly reduce the proportion of those who are only well enough educated to get a dead-end, low-pay job that is about to be automated. The flame you've been charged with igniting is the flame of broadly shared prosperity for a long time to come. The next slide says thank you.
Well, based on what you just said, rather than thank you, it may be also condolence. Boy, that's a pretty big list up there. But let me ask the question. It goes back to the point that you made at the very beginning of the things to do and not do. And it talks about timing. If you go back to the slide, I think it was the second slide,
Mm-hmm.
that last piece, I want to see it again. In that section, the second,
Yep, one sec.
Yeah.
The second slide. Okay.
I think it was the second one.
Okay.
It talked about timing and being patient.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see.
No, good, keep going, again. Oh, yeah.
Got it?
The first bullet there. I
Yep.
think this is quite important because as I've heard from a number of people that have contacted me once they knew of the various people on the board, and just listening to the conversation, it appears to me that a number of people think in terms of quick fixes.
Mm-hmm.
If you just did X or Y and you devote an amount of resources to this particular endeavor, then you're likely to get very quick results in a very positive way. In order to have long-term meaningful results that are sustainable, that are predictable, it will take some time in order to do that. This is not a quick fix process, but the public thinks, unfortunately, that it's a matter of simply turning the switch. And so part of our educational effort would be to, A, make certain that we're all working together, including those who are our partners, that this is a long-term engagement, that will be into this struggle for a period of time. We didn't get to this point overnight in terms of our challenges, and we're not going to get out of it overnight. We have to be convincing and making certain people know that we can show results. We can show meaningful results that are going to be staged out over a period of time, but they are not going to be quick fixes here. And the reason I say that is because we want to maintain the support of our partners and the public as a whole.
Yep.
But if they believe that the benchmark is something that comes very quickly, then I think we're setting ourselves up to failure. This is a long-term engagement, a long-term process. And I guess this is what you're pointing to in this first bullet on this slide.
Yeah. I just think you have said it so well. When we were talking with the commission, our way of saying that was to say that this is a country of silver bullet solutions. And the problem is the system. If you don't change the system, which is really dysfunctional in all the ways that we have been talking about, the silver bullet solutions will actually get you nowhere. And I think if you can persuade the public on the point you just made, it will go an awfully long way to making the AIB and the blueprint successful.
Thank you. In additional questions or comments? Are you there, Rachel?
Yes, and I don't see any hands up.
I just, Rachel, this is Britt. Ike, the point you just made is so important. I just wanted to pause a moment and have us all reflect on the fact that we have to help the public understand that we're in this. This is a long distance race. This is not a sprint. And obviously, we're going to want to be able to show some incremental progress along the way to show that things are beginning to work. But that we've got to stay in this. Getting that message out is so important. I am reminded that when we learned one thing as a commission, that there is a state that does, by international comparisons, a pretty good job with education. That's Massachusetts. They have some huge equity issues that need to be addressed, and they recognize that. But overall, their students tend to perform in a fairly competitive way. And the big initiative that they did was to raise standards for teacher education and certification. And they did that, and they didn't get immediate results, but they stuck to it. They had the will to stick with it, and it paid enormous dividends. So it just speaks. There's an example, Ike, of a state that was able to get the message out that we've got to hold fast to this standard. It's going to produce results, and it surely has to some extent for Massachusetts. But anyway, you're making such an important point.
Well, it reminds me of a story that I've told before, and it goes like this. There was a great swimmer who prepared to swim the English Channel between France and Britain. And he trained for a long period of time in all kinds of weather and many conditions. They had a crack team around him. And the distance between the two is about 26, 27 miles. And so he swam about 13 miles. And he was a little bit tired, winded. And the coach and the naysayer said, I don't think that you can make it. So why don't you turn around and swim back? So he turned around, he swam all the way back to the French coast. Now, the moral of that story is that he actually swam 26 miles, but he never got across because he listened to the naysayers. He didn't stick to it.
Yeah.
And what I see here is that the state of Maryland, in our early iterations, with Thornton and some of the other efforts, we've swam the great distance of that part already. And what we are here to do is carry it all the way across to the English shore, not to get disappointed and turn around and swim back, because we waste a lot of effort, the time, energy, and we never got across. My intention is I'm getting across. And that's my goal.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it.
Any more comments before we leave?
All right, let me just say again, thank you all very, very much for the opportunity to do this with you and for your patience with us this afternoon and this enormous deck of slides.
Well, thank you, Mark. I thought the presentation is wonderful and the entire team. Rachel, thank you as well. We have some additional dates, and I think I've mentioned earlier that we need to get together probably sometime after the holidays. There's nothing more than a reception or so here at the house so that we can get a chance to see each other rather than to be looking at each other's heads for a period of time, because we're going to be in this endeavor to get across the English Channel for a long period of time. So, all right, anything else, Rachel?
No, I think that's it.
All right, thanks, guys.